349, Chapter 28. Book Talk begins at... Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from the shores of the Potomac in Virginia, the Old Dominion. Episode 349, Existential Blues. Well, hello. I hope you are doing well. Someone mentioned that Mercury is in retrograde. I don't know if it still is or not, but that, of course, made me concerned for all of us. And actually, come to think of it, that may have something to do with the name of the podcast this week. Actually, the name of the podcast is because some morning last week, I don't remember which one, I woke up with this song in my head. This song, Existential Blues, was a song I heard when I was in 8th grade. I taped it off of the Dr. Demento Funny 5. And for all you young whippersnappers, what I mean when I say I taped it is that I had a cassette recorder next to my speaker. And I recorded the song off the radio, and I must have listened to it, a conservative estimate, probably 200 or 300 times. And I haven't thought about it in 20 years. And all of a sudden I wake up and all the lyrics, all the music, everything, every last detail is going through my mind. And I thought, I wonder if it's on YouTube. So I went and looked, and you will find a link to a video file of the song as it was originally recorded. It has film from The Man of La Mancha playing. So don't pay any attention to the movie. If you listen to the entire song, it will make sense why they showed The Man of La Mancha. And the reason why I'm linking to that and not a different version is because the different versions that are on YouTube have clipped part of the song out. I am assuming for legal reasons, but this particular one has not been taken down. So enjoy it in its full grandeur and real complete weirdness. But I learned a lot of terminology, like the song Existential Blues made me go and look up existentialism when I was in 8th grade. And so there were lots of jokes that I wound up being able to understand just because of that completely whacked out song. So I have that link for you in my completely random weirdness. But north and south. Do we have an interesting chapter for you? Last week, Mama G, and thank you so much, was good enough to copy and paste her post from one of the Ravelry discussions on the CraftLit board, which I seriously just have not had a chance to get to for a couple of months. It's this bloody gainful employment. It's just really causing trouble. But Mama G's post, I thought, was very interesting, and I really can't disagree with anything. She says, I was holding judgment of Mrs. Hale and Mr. Hale, but I'm done. I am sympathetic to her physical plight, but what a whiner. I'd forgotten how deep under the skin irritating her complaining is. Which leads me to this thought. Is it a rule that the romantic Victorian writers have such feeble parents? Earlier I had noted that the Hales need to be largely out of pocket so that Margaret can, like any good fairy tale girl, spread her wings and have her adventure that brings her to adulthood. Elizabeth Bennet has the same experience in Pride and Prejudice. Maybe I answered my own question. In both cases, the mothers are concerned with the self, not necessarily narcissistically, but their interest in their daughters is unfocused. Mrs. Bennet, at least, is obsessed with her daughters and her own future. She may be obnoxious, but at least she is aware of them. Mrs. Hale, as we see her, is horrible. Was it really the fashion to tell a child she was ugly? Over and over? I don't tell my children they're beautiful, but I don't compare them. Really, I don't. Or natter on about their physical beauty. Margaret just takes it gracefully. I mean, really. Margaret, Frederick was so beautiful. I saw you and I said, oh, what an ugly baby. Heather's expressed her frustration with Mr. Hale and his dim-witted professor approach to life. My term, not putting words into her mouth, although you're welcome to because those were good words. And I agree. He skates the surface of his relationship with Margaret, but he seems to acknowledge how heavily he leans on her, whereas Mrs. Hale leans and pushes and doesn't think about it. Bring Frederick. How about noticing your daughter having some kind of gash on her head where she was knocked with a rock? Mr. Bennet is also the dim-witted professor, taking more interest in his library than his children and wife. There are so many places in the text where his disdain is thick and painful to read. I really do have to take a deep breath and consider the time and social norms with these relationships. I want Margaret to say something, though I know she never will. I want her to shake her mother. I want her to point out the big knock on her head to her father. But that isn't what will happen. Those 19th century girls challenging the world, but won't tell their parents to stick it. And this week's chapter is going to fall so squarely in the middle of everything that Mama G just wrote. And by the way, I hope I did it justice. Her writing is really fun to read out loud, so I had fun. So Mama G's preemptive strike on this week's chapter is fortuitous because things do start to alter just a bit. So far, we really have seen Margaret just kind of not even react to some of the, as Mama G said, horrible things that have been said around her, to her, about her. And we can kind of chalk that up to being the good Victorian girl. And I think some of that is because Gaskell, my guess is Gaskell could really only push things so far before people wouldn't want to read her story anymore. Margaret is way out in front of so many other things in the Victorian world, in the way she takes charge of things, and even the ways that she speaks to Mr. Thornton. She is so not a wilting flower at all. But in today's chapter, her mother is going to say something, and Margaret is going to bite her tongue. And the only clue Gaskell gives us is that she makes a carriage return, or in her case, drops down to the next line and writes, Margaret was silent. And that's it. That's all we get. But it's the first time I can remember having that happen, where it's split away from the other paragraphs, and it is simply said, not implied, actually stated. And then it goes on from there, where we do get to see a little bit inside Margaret's mind and how difficult a time she is having coming up with small talk after her mother's whining at that point. So yes, some of this can just be chalked up to, like young adult fiction these days. Harry Potter is an orphan. All of these kind of coming of age books, the kids aren't there with their parents. In Twilight, Bella's away from her mother and her father works all the time. In The Hunger Games, Katniss is sent off alone away from her family. Her father's dead. This is classic trope for young adult literature. And in many ways, a lot of the books that we read on CraftLit would, I suppose, kind of fall under that style, that kind of storytelling structure or trope. And that's fine, really. But I know I have a harder time, and it seems like some of you are having a harder time too, with the useless parent. Absent parent is one thing, fine. Useless parent is really frustrating. And useless kind of cruel, casually cruel, not purposefully cruel, but just kind of, accidentally mean. Those kind of parents are really hard to read, and they're certainly hard to sympathize with. But although this chapter could be titled How Not to Treat Your Children, instead of being titled Comfort and Sorrow, I think it's going to be interesting for you because you will see two very different relationships with children happening from two different families. And that's kind of cool, albeit sad. But we also are going to get to see, for I think the first time, a new paradigm start to take place. And of course, this is volume 2. This would be volume 2, chapter 3, if you have a book that's numbered that way, or chapter 28 if you don't. But we're going to see a new paradigm start to rise. And that is that Margaret, in today's chapter, I think is going to become the pivot between two opposing views of life in the workplace. And that would be Mr. Thornton and Mr. Higgins. And I think she's also going to become the pivot point between two different religious, or maybe not religious, but philosophical stances. And that would be her father and Mr. Higgins. So you're going to see Margaret start to be positioned a little bit differently from how she was in the first half of the book. And I think this is the chapter where that motion starts to happen. So watch the dichotomy, that split between how Margaret treats Thornton and how Margaret treated Thornton out on the front step during the riot, and how she deals with Higgins in this chapter. We'll talk more about that when we come back from listening to the chapter. And you may recall last week we saw the death of Bessie Higgins, and young Mary came and asked Margaret to come and view the body, which Margaret has never done before. And so we pick up right where we left off this week with Margaret heading over to the Higgins household. Now, it being the Higgins household, there's going to be a lot of slang used, and I'm going to go over some of the finer points of some of the more lengthy conversations that they will be having today, because I want to make sure some of the things that get said are crystal clear, because I think they are interesting and important. The other thing is there are quite a few Bible verses that will be mentioned today. I have linked out to all of them from the show notes. So if you are interested in hearing more or seeing more of where these things came from, that'll make it easy for you. I can tell you right off the bat, at the very beginning of the chapter, you'll hear lines from the book of Revelations, the book of Isaiah, and the book of Psalms. And later, much later in the chapter, you will hear a reference to the chapter 14 of the book of Job. Of course, Job is the poor man who suffered so greatly in the Old Testament story. And you'll hear one final reference to a verse that mentions sour grapes and somebody having their teeth on edge. That actually comes from Ezekiel. And that is the final Bible verse. That's a lot of Bible verses to pack into one chapter. But like I said, I mean, the existential blues thing, the title for the podcast this week, it kind of does fit, because there's a lot of philosophy that gets discussed today. And I always have fun with that stuff. So I hope you do too. Ost means tried. Varsal is universal. Dreed is endured. And brossen is broken. And in context, you may not even hear that those words are odd. But if you saw them on the page, you'd go, "Huh?" So that's what those are. And I have transcribed that onto the show notes as well. So if you look at the literary links of interest for today's chapter, you'll find all of that. There's also something that gets mentioned, shining shoes with a candle stub. And at first I thought, what? And then I went and I found the coolest website. There is one man, a guy, who still makes traditional clogs in the old way. And he has a web page, and he has videos, and he has all this cool information. And so I linked out to his page, and from there you can get to his videos. But the clogs are not the kind of clogs I thought of. I was thinking of the kinds of clogs that I wear, which are Dansko clogs, and they're pretty heavy. But then, of course, there were other clogs like when my mom lived in Holland, I think the wooden shoes that they had were referred to as clogs, those kind of heavy wooden shoes that if you were going to be walking around in the mud, keep yourself up above the muck as much as possible. So big, thick-soled wooden shoes. That is not what they're talking about. If this guy's website is at all accurate, and he claims to be Victorianly accurate, making up more words as I go recklessly, they don't look like the kind of clogs I thought they did, or I thought they would. So you can go take a look and see, but you can kind of understand that if you were, say, next to a stove and you had the stub end of a candle and you were rubbing the candle against your clogs and keeping it close to the stove or the fireplace, you'd wind up melting the wax right into the leather, and that would be A, great waterproofing, but B, something that you could then buff to a shine. So it does make sense. At first I was thinking, what? And then I went, oh, no, that's probably how people have been doing it for a really long time, Heather. I just don't have that many shoes that need to be shined, which is so sad, but there it is. And I think that is all you will need before we start to listen. So here we go with Chapter 28, or Volume 2, Chapter 3 of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Chapter 28. Comfort in Sorrow. Through cross to crown, and though thy spirit's life trials untold assail with giant strength, good cheer, soon ends the bitter strife, and thou shalt reign in peace with Christ at length. Kostgarten. Aye, sooth, we feel too strong in will to need thee on that road, but, woe being come, the soul is dumb that crieth not on God. Mrs. Browning. That afternoon she walked swiftly to the Higginses' house. Mary was looking out for her with a half-distrustful face. Margaret smiled into her eyes to reassure her. They passed quickly through the house-place, upstairs, and into the quiet presence of the dead. Then Margaret was glad that she had come. The face, often so weary with pain, so restless with troublous thoughts, had now the faint soft smile of eternal rest upon it. The slow tears gathered into Margaret's eyes, but a deep calm entered her soul, and that was death. It looked more peaceful than life. All beautiful scriptures came into her mind. They rest from their labors. The weary are at rest. He giveth his beloved sleep. Slowly, slowly, Margaret turned away from the bed. Mary was humbly sobbing in the background. They went downstairs without a word. Resting his hand upon the house table, Nicholas Higgins stood in the midst of the floor. His great eyes startled open by the news he had heard as he came along the court from many busy tongues. His eyes were dry and fierce, studying the reality of her death, bringing himself to understand that her place should know her no more. For she had been sickly, dying so long that he had persuaded himself that she would not die, that she would pull through. Margaret felt as if she had no business to be there, familiarly acquainting herself with the surroundings of death which he, the father, had only just learnt. There had been a pause of an instant on the steep, crooked stair when she first saw him, but now she tried to steal past his abstracted gaze and to leave him in the solemn circle of his household misery. Mary sat down on the first chair she came to, and throwing her apron over her head, began to cry. The noise appeared to rouse him. He took sudden hold of Margaret's arm, and held her till he could gather the words to speak. They seemed dry, They came up thick and choked and hoarse. "Were you with her? Did you see her die?" "No," replied Margaret, standing still with the utmost patience. Now she found herself perceived. It was some time before he spoke again, but he kept his hold on her arm. "All men must die," said he at last, with a strange sort of gravity which first suggested to Margaret the idea that he had been drinking, not enough to intoxicate himself, but enough to make his thoughts bewildered. "But she were younger than me." Still he pondered over the event, not looking at Margaret, though he grasped her tight. Suddenly he looked up at her with a wild, searching inquiry in his glance. "You sure and certain she's dead, not in a dwam or faint? She's been so before, often." "She is dead," replied Margaret. She felt no fear in speaking to him, though he hurt her arm with his grip, and wild gleams came across the stupidity of his eyes. "She is dead," she said. He looked at her still with that searching look, which seemed to fade out of his eyes as he gazed. Then he suddenly let go his hold of Margaret, and, throwing his body half across the table, he shook it and every piece of furniture in the room with his violent sobs. Mary came trembling towards him. "Get thee gone! Get thee gone!" he cried, striking wildly and blindly at her. "What do I care for thee?" Margaret took her hand and held it softly in hers. He tore his hair, he beat his head against the hard wood, then he lay exhausted and stupid. Still his daughter and Margaret did not move. Mary trembled from head to foot. At last, it might have been a quarter of an hour, it might have been an hour, he lifted himself up. His eyes were swollen and bloodshot, and he seemed to have forgotten that anyone was by. He scowled at the watchers when he saw them. He shook himself heavily, gave them one more sullen look, spoke never a word, but made for the door. "Oh, father, father," said Mary, throwing herself upon his arm. "Not tonight, any night but tonight. Oh, help me. He is going out to drink again. Father, I'll not leave you. You may strike, but I'll not leave you. She told me last of all to keep you from drink." But Margaret stood in the doorway, silent yet commanding. He looked up at her defyingly. "It's my own house. Stand out of the way, wench, or I'll make you." He had shaken off Mary with violence. He looked ready to strike Margaret, but she never moved a feature, never took her deep, serious eyes off him. He stared back on her with gloomy fierceness. If she had stirred hand or foot, he would have thrust her aside with even more violence than he had used to his own daughter, whose face was bleeding from her fall against a chair. "What are you looking at me in that way for?" asked he at last, daunted and awed by her severe calm. "If you think for to keep me from going what gate I choose because she loved you, and in my own house too, where I never asked you to come, you're mistaken. It's very hard upon a man that he can't go to the only comfort left." Margaret felt that he acknowledged her power. What could she do next? He had seated himself on a chair close to the door, half conquered, half resenting, intending to go out as soon as she left her position, but unwilling to use the violence he had threatened not 5 minutes before. Margaret laid her hand on his arm. "Come with me," she said. "Come and see her." The voice in which she spoke was very low and solemn, but there was no fear or doubt expressed in it, either of him or of his compliance. He sullenly rose up. He stood uncertain, with dogged irresolution upon his face. She waited him there, quietly and patiently waited for his time to move. He had a strange pleasure in making her wait, but at last he moved towards the stairs. She and he stood by the corpse. Her last words to Mary were, "Keep my father from drink."
"It canna hurt her now,"
muttered he.
"Naught can hurt her now."
Then, raising his voice to a wailing cry, he went on.
"We may quarrel and fall out. We may make peace and be friends. We may clem to skin and bone, and not o' all our griefs will ever touch her more. There's that a portion on 'em, what with hard work first, and sickness at last, has led the life of a dog, and to die without knowing one good piece of rejoicing in all her days. Nay, wench, whatever her said, I can know naught about it now, and I mun ha' a sup o' drink just to steady me against sorrow."
"No," said Margaret, softening with his softened manner. "You shall not. If her life has been what you say, at any rate, she did not fear death as some do. Oh, you should have heard her speak of the life to come, the life hidden with God, that she is now gone to." He shook his head, glancing sideways up at Margaret as he did so. His pale, haggard face struck her painfully. "You are sorely tired. Where have you been all day? Not at work?"
"Not at work, sure enough," said he, with a short, grim laugh. "Not at what you call work. I were at the committee till I was sickened out with trying to make fools hear reason. I were fetched to Boucher's wife afore 7 this morning. She's bedfast, but she were raving and raging to know where her dunder-headed brute of a chap was, as if I'd to keep him, as if he were fit to be ruled by me. The damned fool was put his foot in all our plans. And I've walked my feet sore with going about for to see men who wouldn't be seen, now the law is raised again us. And I were sore-hearted too, which is worse than sore-footed, and if I did see a friend who asked to treat me, I never knew who lay a-dying here. Bess, lass, thou'd believe me? Thou wouldst, wouldn't thou?"
turning to the poor dumb form with wild appeal. "I am sure," said Margaret, "I am sure you did not know. It was quite sudden, but now, you see, it would be different. You do know. You do see her lying there. You hear what she said with her last breath. You will not go?" No answer. In fact, where was he to look for comfort? "Come home with me," said she at last, with a bold venture, half trembling at her own proposal as she made it. "At least you shall have some comfortable food, which I'm sure you need."
"Your father's a parson?" asked he, with a sudden turn in his ideas.
"He was," said Margaret shortly.
"I'll go and take a dish of tea with him, since you've asked me. I've many a thing I often wish to say to a parson, and I'm not particular as to whether he's preaching now or not."
Margaret was perplexed. His drinking tea with her father, who would be totally unprepared for his visitor, her mother so ill, seemed utterly out of the question, and yet, if she drew back now, it would be worse than ever, sure to drive him to the gin shop. She thought that if she could only get him to their own house, it was so great a step gained that she would trust to the chapter of accidents for the next.
"Goodbye, old wench. We've parted company at last, we have. But thou'st been a blessing to thy father ever since thou were born. Bless thy white lips, lass. They've a smile on 'em now, and I'm glad to see it once again, though I'm lone and forlorn for evermore."
He stooped down and fondly kissed his daughter, covered up her face, and turned to follow Margaret. She had hastily gone downstairs to tell Mary of the arrangement, to say it was the only way she could think of to keep him from the gin palace, to urge Mary to come too, for her heart smote her at the idea of leaving the poor affectionate girl alone. But Mary had friends among the neighbors, she said, who would come in and sit a bit with her. It was all right. But father— He was there by them as she would have spoken more. He had shaken off his emotion, as if he was ashamed of having ever given way to it, and had even o'erleaped himself so much that he assumed a sort of bitter mirth, like the crackling of thorns under a pot.
I'm going to take my tea with her father, I am.
But he slouched his cap low down over his brow as he went out into the street, and looked neither to the right nor to the left while he tramped along by Margaret's side. He feared being upset by the words, still more the looks, of sympathizing neighbors. So he and Margaret walked in silence. As he got near the street in which he knew she lived, he looked down at his clothes, his hands and shoes.
I should may happen to clean myself first.
It certainly would have been desirable, but Margaret assured him he should be allowed to go into the yard and have soap and towel provided. She could not let him slip out of her hands just then. While he followed the house servant along the passage and through the kitchen, stepping cautiously on every dark mark in the pattern of the oilcloth in order to conceal his dirty footprints, Margaret ran upstairs. She met Dixon on the landing. "How is Mamma? Where is Papa?" Mrs. was tired and gone into her own room. She had wanted to go to bed, but Dixon had persuaded her to lie down on the sofa and have her tea brought to her there. It would be better than getting restless by being too long in bed. So far, so good, but where was Mr. Hale? In the drawing-room. Margaret went in half breathless with the hurried story she had to tell. Of course, she told it incompletely, and her father was rather taken aback by the idea of the drunken weaver awaiting him in his quiet study, with whom he was expected to drink tea, and on whose behalf Margaret was anxiously pleading. The meek, kind-hearted Mr. Hale would have readily tried to console him in his grief, but, unluckily, the point Margaret dwelt upon most forcibly was the fact of his having been drinking, and her having brought him home with her as a last expedient to keep him from the gin shop. One little event had come out of another so naturally that Margaret was hardly conscious of what she had done, till she saw the slight look of repugnance on her father's face. "Oh, Papa, he really is a man you will not dislike, if you won't be shocked to begin with."
"But, Margaret, to bring a drunken man home, and your mother so ill."
Margaret's countenance fell. "I am sorry, Papa. He is very quiet. He is not tipsy at all. He was only rather strange at first, but that might be the shock of poor Bessie's death." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Hale took hold of her sweet, pleading face in both his hands and kissed her forehead.
"It is all right, dear. I'll go and make him as comfortable as I can, and do you attend to your mother. Only, if you can come in and make a third in the study, I shall be glad."
"Oh, yes, thank you." But as Mr. Hale was leaving the room, she ran after him. "Papa, you must not wonder at what he says. He does not believe in much of what we do."
"Oh, dear, a drunken infidel weaver,"
said Mr. Hale to himself in dismay. But to Margaret he only said,
"If your mother goes to sleep, be sure you come directly."
Margaret went into her mother's room. Mrs. Hale lifted herself up from a doze.
"When did you write to Frederick, Margaret? Yesterday or the day before?"
"Yesterday, Mamma."
"Yesterday? And the letter went?"
"Yes, I took it myself."
"Oh, Margaret, I'm so afraid of his coming. If he should be recognized, if he should be taken, if he should be executed after all these years that he has kept away and lived in safety. I keep falling asleep and dreaming that he is caught and being tried."
"Oh, Mamma, don't be afraid. There will be some risk, no doubt, but We will lessen it as much as ever we can, and it is so little. Now, if we were at Helston, there would be 20, 100 times as much. There, everybody would remember him, and if there was a stranger known to be in the house, they would be sure to guess it was Frederick. While here, nobody knows or cares for us enough to notice what we do. Dixon will keep the door like a dragon, won't you, Dixon, while he's here? They'll be clever if they come in past me, said Dixon, showing her teeth at the bare idea. And he need not go out, except in the dusk, poor fellow. Poor fellow, echoed Mrs. Hale. But I almost wish you had not written. Would it be too late to stop him if you wrote again, Margaret? I'm afraid it would, Mamma, said Margaret, remembering the urgency with which she had entreated him to come directly if he wished to see his mother alive. I always dislike that doing things in such a hurry, said Mrs. Hale. Margaret was silent. Come now, Mum, said Dixon with a kind of cheerful authority. You know seeing Master Frederick is just the very thing of all others you're longing for, and I'm glad Miss Margaret wrote off straight without shilly-shallying. I've had a great mind to do it myself, and would keep him snug, depend upon it. There's only Martha in the house that would not do a good deal to save him on a pinch, and I've been thinking she might go and see her mother just at that very time. She's been saying once or twice she should like to go, for her mother has had a stroke since she came here, only she didn't like to ask. But I'll see about her being safe off as soon as we know when he comes. God bless him. So take your tea, Mum, in comfort, and trust to me. Mrs. Hale did trust in Dixon more than in Margaret. Dixon's words quieted her for the time. Margaret poured out the tea in silence, trying to think of something agreeable to say, but her thoughts made answer something like Daniel O'Rourke when the man in the moon asked him to get off his reaping hook. The more you ax us, the more we won't stir. The more she tried to think of something, anything besides the danger to which Frederick would be exposed, the more closely her imagination clung to the unfortunate idea presented to her. Her mother prattled with Dixon and seemed to have utterly forgotten the possibility of Frederick being tried and executed. Utterly forgotten that, at her wish, if by Margaret's deed, he was summoned into this danger. Her mother was one of those who throw out terrible possibilities, miserable probabilities, unfortunate chances of all kinds, as a rocket throws out sparks. But if the sparks light on some combustible matter, they smoulder first and burst out into a frightful flame at last. Margaret was glad when, her filial duties gently and carefully performed, she could go down into the study. She wondered how her father and Higgins had got on. In the first place, the decorous, kind-hearted, simple, old-fashioned gentleman had unconsciously called out by his own refinement and courteousness of manner all the latent courtesy in the other. Mr. Hale treated all his fellow creatures alike. It never entered into his head to make any difference because of their rank. He placed a chair for Nicholas, stood up till he, at Mr. Hale's request, took a seat, and called him invariably Mr. Higgins instead of the curt Nicholas or Higgins to which the drunken infidel weaver had been accustomed. But Nicholas was neither an habitual drunkard nor a thorough infidel. He drank to drown care, as he would have himself expressed it, and he was infidel so far as he had never yet found any form of faith to which he could attach himself, heart and soul. Margaret was a little surprised and very much pleased when she found her father and Higgins in earnest conversation, each speaking with gentle politeness to the other, however their opinions might clash. Nicholas, clean, tidied, if only at the pump trough, and quiet-spoken, was a new creature to her, who had only seen him in the rough independence of his own hearthstone. He had slicked his hair down with the fresh water. He had adjusted his neck handkerchief and borrowed an odd candle end to polish his clogs with, and there he sat, enforcing some opinion on her father, with a strong Darkshire accent, it is true, but with a lowered voice and a good earnest composure on his face. Her father, too, was interested in what his companion was saying. He looked round as she came in, smiled, and quietly gave her his chair, and then sat down afresh as quickly as possible, and with a little bow of apology to his guest for the interruption. Higgins nodded to her as a sign of greeting, and she softly adjusted her working materials on the table and prepared to listen.
As I was a-saying, sir, I reckon you'd not have much belief in you if you'd lived here, if you'd been bred here. I ask your pardon if I use wrong words, but what I mean by belief just now is thinking on sayings and maxims and promises made by folk you never saw, about the things and the life you never saw, no one else. Now you say these things are true things, and true sayings and a true life. I just say, where's the proof? There's many and many a one wiser and scores better learned than I am around me. Folk who've had time to think on these things, while my time has had to be given up to getting my bread. Well, I sees these people. Their lives is pretty much open to me. They're real folk. They don't believe in the Bible, not they. They may say they do for form's sake, but, Lord, sir, do you think their first cry in the morning is, "What shall I do to get hold on eternal life?" Or, "What shall I do to fill my purse this blessed day? Where shall I go? What bargains shall I strike?" The purse and the gold and the notes is real things, things as can be felt and touched, them's realities, and eternal life is all a talk, very fit for. I ask your pardon, sir, you're a parson at work, I believe. Well, I'll never speak disrespectful of a man in the same fix as I'm in myself, but I'll just ask you another question, sir, and I do not want you to answer it, only to put in your pipe and smoke it afore you go for to set down on us, who only believe in what we see, as fools and noddies. If salvation and life to come and what not was true, not in men's words, but in men's heart's core, don't you not think they'd din us with as they do with political economy? They're mighty anxious to come round us with that piece of wisdom, but the other would be a greater conversion, if it were true.
But the masters have nothing to do with your religion. All that they are connected with you is in trade, so they think, and all that it concerns them, therefore, to rectify your opinions in is the science of trade.
I'm glad, sir, said Higgins with a curious wink of his eye, that you put in so they think. I'd ha' thought you a hypocrite, I'm afeard, if you hadn't, for all you're a parson, or rather because you're a parson. You see, if you'd spoken o' religion as a thing that, if it was true, it didn't concern all men to press on all men's attention above everything else in this versal earth, I should have thought you a knave for to be a parson, and I'd rather think you a fool than a knave. No offence, I hope, sir.
None at all. You consider me mistaken, and I consider you far more fatally mistaken. I don't expect to convince you in a day, not in one conversation, but let us know each other and speak freely to each other about these things, and the truth will prevail. I should not believe in God if I did not believe that. Mr. Higgins, I trust whatever else you have given up, you believe. Mr. Hale's voice dropped low in reverence. You believe in him? Nicholas Higgins suddenly stood straight, stiff up. Margaret started to her feet, for she thought by the working of his face he was going into convulsions. Mr. Hale looked at her dismayed. At last, Higgins found words.
Man, I could fell you to the ground for tempting me. Whatten business have you to try me with your doubts? Think o' her lying there, after the life hers led, and think then how you deny me the one sole comfort left, that there is a God, and that he set her life. I do not believe she'll ever live again, said he, sitting down and drearily going on as if to the unsympathizing fire. I do not believe in any other life than this, in which she dreed such trouble and had such never-ending care, and I cannot bear to think it were all a set of chances that might have been altered with a breath of wind. There's many a time when I've thought I did not believe in God, but I never put it fair out before me in words as many men do. I may ha' laughed at those who did to brave it out like, but I've looked round at after to see if he heard me, if so be there was a he. But today, when I'm left desolate, I wonnot listen to you with your questions and your doubts. There's but one thing steady and quiet in all this reeling world, and reason or no reason, I'll cling to that. It's all very well for happy folk.
Margaret touched his arm very softly. She had not spoken before, nor had he heard her rise. Nicholas, we do not want to reason. You misunderstand my father. We do not reason. We believe, and so do you. It is the one sole comfort in such times. He turned round and caught her hand.
Aye, 'tis,
brushing away the tears with the back of his hand.
But, you know, she's lying dead at home, and I'm welly dazed with sorrow, and at times I hardly know what I'm saying. It's as if speeches folk have made, clever and smart things as I've thought at the time, come up now my heart's welly broken. The strike's failed as well, don't you know that, miss? I were coming home to ask her like a beggar as I am for a bit of comfort in that trouble, and I were knocked down by one who telled me she were dead, just dead, that were all. But that were enough for me.
Mr. Hale blew his nose and got up to snuff the candles in order to conceal his emotion.
He's not an infidel, Margaret. How could you say so?
Muttered he reproachfully.
I've a good mind to read him the 14th chapter of Job.
Not yet, Papa, I think. Perhaps not at all. Let us ask him about the strike, and give him all the sympathy he needs and hope to have from poor Bessie. So they questioned and listened. The workmen's calculations were based, like too many of the masters, on false premises. They reckoned on their fellow men as if they possessed the calculable powers of machines, no more, no less, no allowance for human passions getting the better of reason, as in the case of Boucher and the rioters, and believing that the representations of their injuries would have the same effect on strangers far away as the injuries, fancied or real, had upon themselves. They were consequently surprised and indignant at the poor Irish who had allowed themselves to be imported and brought over to take their places. This indignation was tempered in some degree by contempt for them Irishers, and by pleasure at the idea of the bungling way in which they would set to work, and perplex their new masters with their ignorance and stupidity, strange exaggerated stories of which were already spreading through the town. But the most cruel cut of all was that of the Milton workmen, who had defied and disobeyed the commands of the Union to keep the peace, whatever came, who had originated discord in the camp, and spread the panic of the law being arrayed against them. "And so the strike is at an end," said Margaret.
"Aye, miss, it's save as save can. The factory doors will need open wide tomorrow to let in all who be axing for work. If it's only just to show they'd naught to do with a measure which, if we'd been made of the right stuff, would have brought wages up to a point they'd not been at this 10 year.
"You'll get work, shan't you?" asked Margaret. "You're a famous workman, are not you?"
April let me work at his mill when he cuts off his right hand, not before and not after,"
said Nicholas quietly. Margaret was silenced and sad.
"About the wages,"
said Mr. Hale. "You'll not be offended, but I think you made some sad mistakes. I should like to read you some remarks in a book I have." He got up and went to his bookshelves.
"You needn't trouble yourself, sir," said Nicholas. "Their book stuff goes in at one ear and out at t'other. I can make note on it. Afore Amper and me had this split, the overlooker telled him I was stirring up the men to ask for higher wages, and Amper met me one day in the yard. He'd a thin book in his hand, and he says, 'Higgins, I'm told you're one of those damned fools that think you can get higher wages for asking for 'em, aye, and keep 'em up too when you forced 'em up. Now, I'll give you a chance and try if you've any sense in you. Here's a book written by a friend of mine, and if you read it you'll see how wages find their own level without either masters or men having aught to do with them, except the men cut their own throats with striking like the confounded noodles they are.' Well now, sir, I put it to you, being a parson, and having been in the preaching line, and having had to try and bring folk o'er to what you thought was a right way of thinking. Did you begin by calling 'em fools and such like, or didn't you rather give 'em some kind words at first to make 'em ready for to listen and be convinced if they could? And in your preaching, did you stop every now and then and say, after them and after yourself, 'But you're such a pack of fools that I've a strong notion it's no use me trying to put sense into you'? I were not in the best state, I'll own, for taking in what Amper's friend had to say. I were so vexed at the way it were put to me, but I thought, come, I'll see what these chaps have got to say, and try if it's them or me as is the noodle. So I took the book and tugged at it, but, Lord bless you, it went on about capital and labour and capital till it fair sent me off to sleep. I never could rightly fix it in my mind which was which, and it spoke on 'em as if they was virtues or vices, and what I wanted for to know were the rights o' men, whether they were rich or poor, so be they only were men."
"But for all that," said Mr. Hale, "and granting to the full the offensiveness, the folly, the unchristianness of Mr. Hamper's way of speaking to you in recommending his friend's book, yet if it told you what he said it did, that wages find their own level, and that the most successful strike can only force them up for a moment, to sink in far greater proportion afterwards, in consequence of that very strike, the book would have told you the truth."
"Well, sir," said Higgins rather doggedly, "it might, or it might not. There's two opinions go to settling that point. But suppose it was truth double strong, it were no truth to me if I couldna take it in. I dare say there's truth in yon Latin book on your shelves, but it's gibberish and not truth to me unless I know the meaning of the words. If you, sir, or any other knowledgeable patient man come to me and says he'll learn me what the words mean, and not blow me up if I'm a bit stupid, or forget how one thing hangs on another, why, in time I may get to see the truth of it, or I may not. I'll not be bound to say I shall end in thinking the same as any man, and I'm not one who think truth can be shaped out in words all neat and clean, as the men at the foundry cut out sheet iron. Same bones won't go down with everyone. It'll stick here in this man's throat and there into others. Let alone that, when down, it may be too strong for this one, too weak for that. Folk who sets up to doctor the world with their truth mun suit different for different minds, and be a bit tender in the way of giving it to, or the poor sick fools may spit it out in their faces. Now Amper first gives me a box on my ear, and then he throws his big bolus at me and says he reckons it'll do me no good, I'm such a fool. But there it is.
"I wish some of the kindest and wisest of the masters would meet some of you men and have a good talk on these things. It would surely be the best way of getting over your difficulties, which I do believe arise from your ignorance, excuse me, Mr. Higgins, on subjects which it is for the mutual interest of both masters and men should be well understood by both. I wonder," half to his daughter, "if Mr. Thornton might not be induced to do such a thing." "Remember, Papa," said she in a very low voice. "What he said one day about governments, you know?" She was unwilling to make any clearer allusion to the conversation they had held on the mode of governing workpeople, by giving men intelligence enough to rule themselves, or by a wise despotism on the part of the master, for she saw that Higgins had caught Mr. Thornton's name, if not the whole of the speech. Indeed, he began to speak of him.
Thornton, he's the chap as wrote off at once for these Irishers and led to the riot that ruined the strike. Even Amper with all his bullying would have waited for a while, but it's a word and a blow with Thornton. And now, when the Union would have thanked him for following up the chase after Boucher, and them chaps as went right again our commands, it's Thornton who steps forward and coolly says that, as the strike's at an end, he, as party injured, doesn't want to press the charges against the rioters. I thought he'd had more pluck. I thought he'd have carried his point and had his revenge in an open way. But, says he, one in court told me his very words, they are well known. They will find the natural punishment of their conduct in the difficulty they will meet with in getting employment. That will be severe enough. I only wish they'd cotched Boucher and had him up before Amper. I see the old tiger sitting on him. Would he have let them off? Not he.
"Mr. Thornton was right," said Margaret. "You are angry against Boucher, Nicholas, or else you would be the first to see that where the natural punishment would be severe enough for the offence, any farther punishment would be something like revenge." "My daughter is no great friend of Mr. Thornton's," said Mr. Hale, smiling at Margaret, while she, as red as any carnation, began to work with double diligence. "But I believe what she says is the truth. I like him for it."
Well, sir, this strike has been a weary piece of business to me, and you'll not wonder if I'm a bit put out with seeing it fail just for a few men who would not suffer in silence and hold out brave and firm.
"You forget," said Margaret. "I don't know much of Boucher, but the only time I saw him it was not his own sufferings he spoke of, but those of his sick wife, his little children."
True, but he were not made of iron himself. He'd ha' cried out for his own sorrows next. He were not one to bear.
"How came he into the Union?" asked Margaret innocently. "You don't seem to have much respect for him, nor gained much good from having him in." Higgins' brow clouded. He was silent for a minute or two. Then he said, shortly enough,
"It's not for me to speak of the Union. What they does, they does. Them that is of a trade mun hang together, and if they're not willing to take their chance along with the rest, the Union has ways and means."
Mr. Hale saw that Higgins was vexed at the turn the conversation had taken, and was silent. Not so Margaret, though she saw Higgins' feeling as clearly as he did. By instinct she felt that if he could but be brought to express himself in plain words, something clear would be gained on which to argue for the right and the just. "And what are the Union's ways and means?" He looked up at her as if on the point of dogged resistance to her wish for information. But her calm face, fixed on his, patient and trustful, compelled him to answer.
"Well, if a man doesn't belong to the Union, them as works next looms has orders not to speak to him. If he's sorry or ill, it's all the same. He's out of bounds. He's none of us. He comes among us, he works among us, but he's none of us. In some places, them's fine who speaks to him. You try that, miss. Try living a year or two among them as looks away if you look at 'em. Try working within 2 yards of crowds of men who, you know, have a grinding grudge at you in their hearts, to whom if you say you're glad, not an eye brightens nor lip moves, to whom, if your heart's heavy, you can never say naught, because they'll ne'er take notice on your sighs or sad looks, and a man's no man who groan out loud about folk asking him what's the matter. Just you try that, miss. 10 hours for 300 days, and you'll know a bit what the Union is."
"Why," said Margaret, "what tyranny this is! Nay, Higgins, I don't care one straw for your anger. I know you can't be angry with me if you would, and I must tell you the truth, that I never read in all the history I have read of a more slow, lingering torture than this. And you belong to the Union? And you talk of the tyranny of the masters?
Nay, said Higgins, you may say what you like. The dead stand between you and every angry word of mine. Do you think I forget who's lying there and how her loved you? And it's the masters as made us sin if the Union is a sin. Not this generation, maybe, but their fathers. Their fathers ground our fathers to the very dust, ground us to powder. Parson, I reckon I've heard my mother read out a text. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. It's so with them. In those days of sore oppression the Unions began. It were a necessity. It's a necessity now, according to me. It's a withstanding of injustice, past, present, or to come. It may be like war, along with it comes crimes, but I think it were greater crime to let it alone. Our only chance is binding men together in one common interest. And if some are cowards and some are fools, they mun come along and join the great march whose only strength is in numbers.
Oh, said Mr. Hale, sighing, your union in itself would be beautiful, glorious. It would be Christianity itself, if it were but for an end which affected the good of all, instead of that of merely one class as opposed to another.
I reckon it's time for me to be going, sir,
said Higgins as the clock struck 10. Home? Said Margaret very softly. He understood her and took her offered hand.
Oh, miss, you may trust me, though I am one of the Union.
I do trust you most thoroughly, Nicholas. Stay, said Mr. Hale, hurrying to the bookshelves. Mr. Higgins, I'm sure you'll join us in family prayer. Higgins looked at Margaret doubtfully. Her grave, sweet eyes met his. There was no compulsion, only deep interest in them. He did not speak, but he kept his place. Margaret, the churchwoman, her father, the dissenter, Higgins, the infidel, knelt down together. It did them no harm.
So right there at the end, you start to get that dichotomy. You start to see Margaret, the churchwoman, just meaning that she is still a member of the Church of England, her father, the dissenter, and Higgins, the infidel. But he's not. I don't know if it was clear enough. I had to really reread and re-listen to the part of the chapter where Margaret's father asks if Higgins believes in God. And Higgins is thinking that by asking that question, what he's really saying is, I don't believe in God. That's why I stopped being a pastor. Do you? And so he's saying, after he stands up and gets upset, don't take the one thing I've got going for me away. I don't believe she'll ever live again. But I need to believe that she's with God. That's where she wanted to go. That's what I have to believe. And I think that that's the really interesting thing that Gaskell's doing here, is she's making a very clear definition between believing in God and having issues with an organized religion. And I thought she kind of did a lovely job with that, because that's a pretty complicated thing. We still have complications with getting that across. And here we have, back in 1850, we already have that starting. And did you notice way back at the beginning of the chapter how she just stood in the doorway without moving? And there was that line that if she had moved just a little bit, moved a hand, moved an arm, moved an eyebrow, he would have hit her. He would have knocked her out of the way. But because she was that Margaret, that stony, strong, kind of in your face Margaret, he just couldn't do it. Just like with Thornton, he had to listen to her. And the writers had to pay attention until some schmuck tossed a pebble a pebble the size of a rock. I also loved, and I think it went some distance in redeeming Mr. Hale for me, that when Higgins, the infidel weaver, shows up in his study, he pulls out the chair for him and has him sit down first and calls him Mr. Higgins. He doesn't refer to him as a hand, which would be insulting. He is Mr. Higgins, and he is there to talk and to discuss. And I thought it was lovely, the moment when Mr. Hale says, Higgins says, "I'd rather think you a fool than a knave. No offense, I hope, sir." And Hale says, "None at all. You consider me mistaken, and I consider you far more fatally mistaken. I don't expect to convince you in a day, not in one conversation. But let us know each other and speak freely to each other about these things, and the truth will prevail. I should not believe in God if I did not believe in that." And I thought, boy, if all those screaming, shrill voices out on the internet and on TV and everywhere, if they could take a page from Mr. Hale's book right there and just calm down and listen. And I thought it was really interesting, the conversation about the economics of the strike and how Higgins didn't understand where the masters were coming from and where they were going. And the masters didn't understand the strikers. And Gaskell, I think, is doing a pretty marvelous job of letting us see both sides, which has got to be shockingly difficult to do. And I particularly liked that Higgins, when Hamper was giving him a hard time about reading the book, said that he didn't want to know about capital and labor. He wanted to know about the rights of men. If I work a day's job, why can't I make a living wage? And it's just so clear. It's transparent. It's clear that nothing much has changed, but it's so clear that the masters and the hands, the management and the workers don't have a clue about each other or the strains on each other. And not only that, but that the not understanding each other goes all the way to them each thinking the other is stupid. You know, that the masters are stupid to think that the laborers aren't going to rise up, and they just don't understand what's really going on. And the masters think that the laborers are all, lazy, good-for-nothing louts who are just a bunch of stupid people. And if they were smarter, they would have risen to management, like Thornton. And I think, having seen Mr. Thornton's mother in action a few times, I think we can safely say that not everybody would have necessarily been able to rise to the level of Mr. Thornton if they didn't have a mother who was so thrifty and so determined and so focused that I don't think anybody is going to do that alone. And Thornton, it was a family affair getting Thornton to where he is and getting the mill to where it is. And it makes sense then to see Mrs. Thornton being so proprietary about the mill, because in many ways it's her achievement as well, and she should be proud of it. And I thought it was also interesting today that we really saw, for the first time, kind of the inner workings of the union and how Boucher came to be part of the union, and also Higgins's disappointment with people not being able to restrain themselves and just trust the process. I have been in Higgins's position in vaguely similar situations, and it is incredibly frustrating to watch people cut their nose off to spite their face. It's just going against their own self-interest, and they don't get it. And it's incredibly difficult to watch, and it is incredibly depressing to watch as well. And then for poor Higgins to come home and find that Bessie is gone just had to be horrible. But as good Victorians, they end the chapter in prayer, and that can only be a good thing. So we have a nice little resolution. And next week, all sorts of stuff happens. I'm smashing 2 chapters together, and I hope you enjoy them. I hope you enjoyed today's chapter 2. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania.
Well, hello. The moving clock is ticking, and the truck will be loaded when you listen to this, or being unloaded. The final slog. And boy, will I be happy to be in Pennsylvania. So, book talk, because we're hopping right on it this week. If Mr. and Mrs. Hale frustrated you last week, or the weeks prior to these 2 chapters, don't have any sharp objects in your hands while you listen to the podcast this week, please. You might hurt yourself or someone around you, and we don't want that to happen. Literature can make your heart ache, but it shouldn't make you bleed. So just be careful. This week's first chapter, which is chapter 29, or for those of you with the 2-volume set, volume 2, chapter 4. This one is called A Ray of Sunshine, which probably isn't Mrs. Hale suddenly getting well. But something will happen that will make everybody so happy in the house. And that's a short little chapter, and that's fine, because it's kind of a lightweight chapter, and that is fine, really, really fine, because the last couple have been awfully heavy. And we're probably moving into heavy territory again. And, you need to have a break every once in a while. So this chapter is our break. But lightweight though it may be, there is a sentence at the end of the chapter to pay attention to. And it has to do with Mr. Thornton. It's an odd thing because Elizabeth Gaskell actually speaks to us directly. There's like direct address. And I don't remember her doing that anywhere else so far. So that's when that kind of thing happens, that's usually a, hey, pay attention moment, or it's a mistake. But I think this one might be a pay attention moment. So that's the end of chapter 29. And then 30 shows up. And 30 is called Home at Last. Brownie points for anyone who knows who is coming home. Because you probably don't have to work too hard to figure that one out. However, this is where some of you are going to get mightily frustrated. There are only 2 references in this chapter that I think I should go over at all. And then I'm going to just launch you into them because, oh my goodness, we have more to talk about on the other end. Lucifer matches. These have come up in books occasionally. I think we've had these pop up once or twice before in other books. Lucifer matches were the precursors of matches that we have today. They were, little shards of wood that had a tip that was coated with obviously a sulfurous material, something that could ignite easily, but they were also kind of unpredictable. So, you had to be kind of careful with them. And what a great name for them, Lucifer matches. And then we have a little Latin for me to butcher for you. Poeta nascitur non fit, which is poets are born. Nascitur, like nascent or nativity or Navidad. And non fit not made. Poets are born, not made. So that is all the tricky stuff. The rest of it is just listening to these chapters unfold. And then we'll talk on the other end. Catch you later. Here you go with chapters 29 and 30 of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Chapter 29. A Ray of Sunshine. Some wishes crossed my mind and dimly cheered it, and one or two poor melancholy pleasures, each in the pale, unwarming light of hope, silvering its flimsy wing, flew silent by. Moths in the moonbeam. Coleridge. The next morning brought Margaret a letter from Edith. It was affectionate and inconsequent, like the writer. But the affection was charming to Margaret's own affectionate nature, and she had grown up with the inconsequence, so she did not perceive it. It was as follows. "Oh, Margaret, it is worth a journey from England to see my boy. He is a superb little fellow, especially in his caps, and most especially in the one you sent him, you good, dainty-fingered, persevering little lady. Having made all the mothers here envious, I want to show him to somebody new and hear a fresh set of admiring expressions. Perhaps that's all the reason. Perhaps it is not. Nay, possibly there is just a little cousinly love mixed with it, but I do want you so much to come here, Margaret. I'm sure it would be the very best thing for Aunt Hale's health. Everybody here is young and well, and our skies are always blue, and our sun always shines, and the band plays deliciously from morning till night. And, to come back to the burden of my ditty, my baby always smiles. I'm constantly wanting you to draw him for me, Margaret. It does not signify what he is doing. That very thing is prettiest, gracefulest, best. I think I love him a great deal better than my husband, who is getting stout and grumpy, what he calls busy. No, he is not. He has just come in with news of such a charming picnic given by the officers of the Hazard at anchor in the bay below. Because he has brought in such a pleasant piece of news, I retract all I said just now. Did not somebody burn his hand for having said or done something he was sorry for? Well, I can't burn mine, because it would hurt me, and the scar would be ugly, but I'll retract all I said as fast I can. Cosmo is quite as great a darling as baby, and not a bit stout, and as ungrumpy as ever husband was, only sometimes he is very, very busy. I may say that without love, wifely duty. Where was I? I had something very particular to say, I know, once. Oh, it is this. Dearest Margaret, you must come and see me. It would do Aunt Hale good, as I said before. Get the doctor to order it for her. Tell him that it's the smoke of Milton that does her harm. I have no doubt that it is that, really. 3 months, you must not come for less, of this delicious climate, all sunshine and grapes as common as blackberries, would quite cure her. I don't ask my uncle. Here the letter became more constrained and better written. Mr. Hale was in the corner like a naughty child for having given up his living. Because I dare say he disapproves of war and soldiers and bands of music. At least, I know that many dissenters are members of the Peace Society, and I'm afraid he would not like to come. But if he would, dear, pray say that Cosmo and I will do our best to make him happy, and I'll hide up Cosmo's red coat and sword and make the band play all sorts of grave, solemn things. Or, if they do play pomps and vanities, it shall be in double slow time. Dear Margaret, if he would like to accompany you and Aunt Hale, we will try and make it pleasant, though I'm rather afraid of anyone who has done something for conscience's sake. You never did, I hope. Tell Aunt Hale not to bring many warm clothes, though I'm afraid it will be late in the year before you can come. But you have no idea of the heat here. I tried to wear my great beauty Indian shawl at a picnic. I kept myself up with proverbs as long as I could. pride must abide, and such wholesome pieces of pith. But it was no use. I was like Mamma's little dog Tiny with an elephant's trappings on, smothered, hidden, killed with my finery, so I made it into a capital carpet for us all to sit down upon. Here's this boy of mine, Margaret. If you don't pack up your things as soon as you get this letter and come straight off to see him, I shall think you're descended from King Herod." Margaret did long for a day of Edith's life, her freedom from care, her cheerful home, her sunny skies. If a wish could have transported her, she would have gone off just for one day. She yearned for the strength which such a change would give, even for a few hours to be in the midst of that bright life and to feel young again. Not yet 20, and she had had to bear up against such hard pressure that she felt quite old. That was her first feeling after reading Edith's letter. Then she read it again and, forgetting herself, was amused at its likeness to Edith's self, and was laughing merrily over it when Mrs. Hale came into the drawing-room, leaning on Dixon's arm. Margaret flew to adjust the pillows. Her mother seemed more than usually feeble. "What were you laughing at, Margaret?" asked she, as soon as she had recovered from the exertion of settling herself on the sofa. "A letter I have had this morning from Edith. Shall I read it you, Mamma?" She read it aloud, and for a time it seemed to interest her mother, who kept wondering what name Edith had given to her boy, and suggesting all probable names and all possible reasons why each and all of these names should be given. In the very midst of these wonders Mr. Thornton came, bringing another offering of fruit for Mrs. Hale. He could not, say rather he would not, deny himself the chance of the pleasure of seeing Margaret. He had no end in this but the present gratification. It was the sturdy willfulness of a man usually most reasonable and self-controlled. He entered the room, taking in at a glance the fact of Margaret's presence, but after the first cold, distant bow, he never seemed to let his eyes fall on her again. He only stayed to present his peaches, to speak some gentle, kindly words, and then his cold, offended eyes met Margaret's with a grave farewell as he left the room. She sat down silent and pale. "Do you know, Margaret, I really begin quite to like Mr. Thornton." No answer at first. Then Margaret forced out an icy, "Do you?" "Yes, I think he is really getting quite polished in his manners." Margaret's voice was more in order now. She replied, "He is very kind and attentive, there is no doubt of that." "I wonder Mrs. Thornton never calls. She must know I am ill because of the water-bed." "I dare say she hears how you are from her son." "Still, I should like to see her. You have so few friends here, Margaret." Margaret felt what was in her mother's thoughts, a tender craving to bespeak the kindness of some woman towards the daughter that might soon be left motherless. But she could not speak. "Do you think," said Mrs. Hale after a pause, "that you could go and ask Mrs. Thornton to come and see me? Only once. I don't want to be troublesome." "I will do anything if you wish it, Mamma, but when Frederick comes—" "Ah, to be sure, we must keep our doors shut. We must let no one in. I hardly know whether I dare wish him to come or not. Sometimes I think I would rather not. Sometimes I have such frightful dreams about him." "Oh, Mamma, we'll take good care. I will put my arm in the bolt sooner than he should come to the slightest harm. Trust the care of him to me, Mamma. I will watch over him like a lioness over her young." "When can we hear from him?" "Not for a week yet, certainly. Perhaps more." "We must send Martha away in good time. It would never do to have her here when he comes and then send her off in a hurry." "Dixon is sure to remind us of that. I was thinking that If we wanted any help in the house while he is here, we could perhaps get Mary Higgins. She is very slack of work and is a good girl, and would take pains to do her best, I'm sure, and would sleep at home, and need never come upstairs so as to know who is in the house. As you please, as Dixon pleases. But, Margaret, don't get to use these horrid Milton words. Slack of work. It is a provincialism. What will your Aunt Shaw say if she hears you use it on her return? Oh, Mamma, don't try and make a bugbear of Aunt Shaw, said Margaret, laughing. Edith picked up all sorts of military slang from Captain Lennox, and Aunt Shaw never took any notice of it. But yours is factory slang. And if I live in a factory town, I must speak factory language when I want it. Why, Mamma, I could astonish you with a great many words you never heard in your life. I don't believe you know what a knobstick is. Not I, child. I only know it has a very vulgar sound, and I don't want to hear you using it. Very well, dearest mother, I won't. Only I shall have to use a whole explanatory sentence instead. I don't like this Milton, said Mrs. Hale. Edith is right enough in saying it's the smoke that has made me so ill. Margaret started up as her mother said this. Her father had just entered the room, and she was most anxious that the faint impression she had seen on his mind that the Milton air had injured her mother's health should not be deepened, should not receive any confirmation. She could not tell whether he had heard what Mrs. Hale had said or not, but she began speaking hurriedly of other things, unaware that Mr. Thornton was following him. Mamma is accusing me of having picked up a great deal of vulgarity since we came to Milton. The vulgarity Margaret spoke of referred purely to the use of local words, and the expression arose out of the conversation they had just been holding. But Mr. Thornton's brow darkened, and Margaret suddenly felt how her speech might be misunderstood by him, so, in the natural sweet desire to avoid giving unnecessary pain, she forced herself to go forwards with a little greeting and continue what she was saying, addressing herself to him expressly. Now, Mr. Thornton, though knobstick has not a very pretty sound, is it not expressive? Could I do without it in speaking of the thing it represents? If using local words is vulgar, I was very vulgar in the forest, was I not, Mamma? It was unusual with Margaret to obtrude her own subject of conversation on others, but in this case she was so anxious to prevent Mr. Thornton from feeling annoyance at the words he had accidentally overheard that it was not until she had done speaking that she colored all over with consciousness, more especially as Mr. Thornton seemed hardly to understand the exact gist or bearing of what she was saying, but passed her by with a cold reserve of ceremonious movement to speak to Mrs. Hale. The sight of him reminded her of the wish to see his mother and commend Margaret to her care. Margaret, sitting in burning silence, vexed and ashamed of her difficulty in keeping her right place and her calm unconsciousness of heart when Mr. Thornton was by, heard her mother's slow entreaty that Mrs. Thornton would come and see her soon, tomorrow if it were possible. Mr. Thornton promised that she should, conversed a little, and then took his leave, and Margaret's movements and voice seemed at once released from some invisible chains. He never looked at her, and yet the careful avoidance of his eyes betokened that, in some way, he knew exactly where, if they fell by chance, they would rest on her. If she spoke, he gave no sign of attention, and yet his next speech to anyone else was modified by what she had said. Sometimes there was an express answer to what she had remarked, but given to another person as though unsuggested by her. It was not the bad manners of ignorance. It was the willful bad manners arising from deep offense. It was willful at the time, repented of afterwards. But no deep plan, no careful cunning could have stood him in such good stead. Margaret thought about him more than she had ever done before, not with any tinge of what is called love, but with regret that she had wounded him so deeply, and with a gentle, patient striving to return to their former position of antagonistic friendship. For a friend's position was what she found that he had held in her regard, as well as in that of the rest of the family. There was a pretty humility in her behavior to him, as if mutely apologizing for the overstrong words which were the reaction from the deeds of the day of the riot. But he resented those words bitterly. They rung in his ears, and he was proud of the sense of justice which made him go on in every kindness he could offer to her parents. He exulted in the power he showed in compelling himself to face her whenever he could think of any action which might give her father or mother pleasure. He thought that he disliked seeing one who had mortified him so keenly, but he was mistaken. It was a stinging pleasure to be in the room with her and feel her presence. But he was no great analyzer of his own motives, and was mistaken, as I have said. Chapter 30. Home at last. The saddest birds a season find to sing. Southwell. Never to fold the robe or secret pain, never, weighed down by memory's clouds again, to bow thy head. Thou art gone home. Mrs. Hemans. Mrs. Thornton came to see Mrs. Hale the next morning. She was much worse. One of those sudden changes, those great visible strides towards death had been taken in the night, and her own family were startled by the grey, sunken look her features had assumed in that 12 hours of suffering. Mrs. Thornton, who had not seen her for weeks, was softened all at once. She had come because her son had asked it from her as a personal favor, but with all the proud, bitter feelings of her nature in arms against that family, of which Margaret formed one. She doubted the reality of Mrs. Hale's illness. She doubted any want, beyond a momentary fancy on that lady's part, which should take her out of her previously settled course of employment for the day. She told her son that she wished they had never come near the place, that he had never got acquainted with them, that there had been no such useless languages as Latin and Greek ever invented. He bore all this pretty silently, but when she had ended her invective against the dead languages, he quietly returned to the short, curt, decided expression of his wish that she should go and see Mrs. Hale at the time appointed as most likely to be convenient to the invalid. Mrs. Thornton submitted with as bad a grace as she could to her son's desire, all the time liking him the better for having it, and exaggerating in her own mind the same notion that he had of extraordinary goodness on his part in so perseveringly keeping up with the Hales. His goodness verging on weakness, as all the softer virtues did in her mind, and her own contempt for Mr. and Mrs. Hale, and positive dislike to Margaret, were the ideas which occupied Mrs. Thornton, till she was struck into nothingness before the dark shadow of the wings of the angel of death. There lay Mrs. Hale, a mother like herself, a much younger woman than she was, on the bed from which there was no sign of hope that she might ever rise again. No more variety of light and shade for her in that darkened room. No power of action, scarcely change of movement, faint alternations of whispered sound and studious silence, and yet that monotonous life seemed almost too much. When Mrs. Thornton, strong and prosperous with life, came in, Mrs. Hale lay still, although from the look on her face she was evidently conscious of who it was. But she did not even open her eyes for a minute or two. The heavy moisture of tears stood on the eyelashes before she looked up. Then, with her hand groping feebly over the bedclothes for the touch of Mrs. Thornton's large, firm fingers, she said, scarcely above her breath, Mrs. Thornton had to stoop from her erectness to listen, "Margaret,
You have a daughter. My sister is in Italy. My child will be without a mother in a strange place. If I die, will you?" And her filmy, wandering eyes fixed themselves with an intensity of wistfulness on Mrs. Thornton's face. For a minute there was no change in its rigidness. It was stern and unmoved. Nay, but that the eyes of the sick woman were growing dim with the slow gathering tears, she might have seen a dark cloud cross the cold features. And it was no thought of her son or of her living daughter Fanny that stirred her heart at last, but a sudden remembrance, suggested by something in the arrangement of the room, of a little daughter dead in infancy long years ago, that, like a sudden sunbeam, melted the icy crust behind which there was a real, tender woman. "You wish me to be a friend to Miss Ale," said Mrs. Thornton in her measured voice that would not soften with her heart, but came out distinct and clear. Mrs. Hale, her eyes still fixed on Mrs. Thornton's face, pressed the hand that lay below hers on the coverlet. She could not speak. Mrs. Thornton sighed. "I will be a true friend if circumstances require it, not a tender friend. That I cannot be." To her, she was on the point of adding, but she relented at the sight of that poor, anxious face. "It is not my nature to show affection even where I feel it, nor do I volunteer advice in general. Still, at your request, if it will be any comfort to you, I will promise you." Then came a pause. Mrs. Thornton was too conscientious to promise what she did not mean to perform, and to perform anything in the way of kindness on behalf of Margaret, more disliked at this moment than ever, was difficult, almost impossible. "I promise," said she with grave severity, which, after all, inspired the dying woman with faith as in something more stable than life itself. Flickering, flitting, wavering life. "I promise that in any difficulty in which Miss Hale—" "Call her Margaret," gasped Mrs. Hale. "In which she comes to me for help, I will help her with every power I have, as if she were my own daughter. I also promise that if ever I see her doing what I think is wrong—" "But Margaret never does wrong, not willfully wrong," pleaded Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Thornton went on as before, as if she had not heard. "If ever I see her doing what I believe to be wrong, such wrong not touching me or mine, in which case I might be supposed to have an interested motive, I will tell her of it, faithfully and plainly, as I should wish my own daughter to be told." There was a long pause. Mrs. Hale felt that this promise did not include all, and yet it was much. It had reservations in it which she did not understand, but then she was weak, dizzy, and tired. Mrs. Thornton was reviewing all the probable cases in which she had pledged herself to act. She had a fierce pleasure in the idea of telling Margaret unwelcome truths in the shape of performance of duty. Mrs. Hale began to speak. "I thank you. I pray God to bless you. I shall never see you again in this world, but my last words are, I thank you for your promise of kindness to my child." "Not kindness," testified Mrs. Thornton, ungraciously truthful to the last. But having eased her conscience by saying these words, she was not sorry they were not heard. She pressed Mrs. Hale's soft, languid hand, and rose up and went her way out of the house without seeing a creature. During the time that Mrs. Thornton was having this interview with Mrs. Hale, Margaret and Dixon were laying their heads together and consulting how they should keep Frederick's coming a profound secret to all out of the house. A letter from him might now be expected any day, and
he would assuredly follow quickly on its heels. Martha must be sent away on her holiday. Dixon must keep stern guard on the front door, only admitting the few visitors that ever came to the house into Mr. Hale's room downstairs, Mrs. Hale's extreme illness giving her a good excuse for this. If Mary Higgins was required as a help to Dixon in the kitchen, she was to hear and see as little of Frederick as possible, and he was, if necessary, to be spoken of to her under the name of Mr. Dickinson. But her sluggish and incurious nature was the greatest safeguard of all. They resolved that Martha should leave them that very afternoon for this visit to her mother. Margaret wished that she had been sent away on the previous day, as she fancied it might be thought strange to give a servant a holiday when her mistress's state required so much attendance. Poor Margaret! All that afternoon she had to act the part of a Roman daughter and give strength out of her own scanty stock to her father. Mr. Hale would hope, would not despair, between the attacks of his wife's malady. He buoyed himself up in every respite from her pain, and believed that it was the beginning of ultimate recovery. And so when the paroxysms came on, each more severe than the last, they were fresh agonies and greater disappointments to him. This afternoon he sat in the drawing-room, unable to bear the solitude of his study or to employ himself in any way. He buried his head in his arms, which lay folded on the table. Margaret's heart ached to see him, yet as he did not speak, she did not like to volunteer any attempt at comfort. Martha was gone. Dixon sat with Mrs. Hale while she slept. The house was very still and quiet, and darkness came on without any movement to procure candles. Margaret sat at the window, looking out at the lamps in the street, but seeing nothing, only alive to her father's heavy sighs. She did not like to go down for lights, lest the tacit restraint of her presence being withdrawn, he might give way to more violent emotion, without her being at hand to comfort him. Yet she was just thinking that she ought to go and see after the well-doing of the kitchen fire, which there was nobody but herself to attend to, when she heard the muffled door ring with so violent a pull that the wires jingled all through the house, though the positive sound was not great. She started up, past her father, who had never moved at the veiled, dull sound, returned, and kissed him tenderly. And still he never moved, nor took any notice of her fond embrace. Then she went down softly, through the dark, to the door. Dixon would have put the chain on before she opened it, but Margaret had not a thought of fear in her preoccupied mind. A man's tall figure stood between her and the luminous street. He was looking away, but at the sound of the latch he turned quickly round. "Is this Mr. Hale's?" said he, in a clear, full, delicate voice. Margaret trembled all over. At first she did not answer. In a moment she sighed out, "Frederick," and stretched out both her hands to catch his and draw him in. "Oh, Margaret," said he, holding her off by her shoulders after they had kissed each other, as if even in that darkness he could see her face and read in its expression a quicker answer to his questions than words could give. "My mother, is she alive?" "Yes, she is alive, dear, dear brother. She, as ill as she can be, she is, but alive? She is alive." "Thank God," said he. "Papa is utterly prostrate with this great grief." "You expect me, don't you?" "No, we have had no letter." "Then I have come before it, but my mother knows I am coming." "Oh, we all knew you would come, but wait a little. Step in here. Give me your hand. What is this? Oh, your carpet bag. Dixon has shut the shutters, but this is Papa's study, and I can take you to a chair to rest yourself for a few minutes while I go and tell him." She groped her way to the taper and the lucifer matches. She suddenly felt shy when the little feeble light made them visible. All she could see was that her brother's face was unusually dark in complexion, and she caught the stealthy look of a pair of remarkably long-cut blue eyes that suddenly twinkled up with the droll consciousness of their mutual purpose of inspecting each other. But though the brother and sister had an instant of sympathy in their reciprocal glances, they did not exchange a word. Only Margaret felt sure that she should like her brother as a companion as much as she already loved him as a near relation. Her heart was wonderfully lighter as she went upstairs. The sorrow was no less in reality, but it became less oppressive from having someone in precisely the same relation to it as that in which she stood. Not her father's desponding attitude had power to damp her now. He lay across the table, helpless as ever, but she had the spell by which to rouse him. She used it, perhaps, too violently in her own great relief. "Papa!" said she, throwing her arms fondly round his neck, pulling his weary head up, in fact, with her gentle violence till it rested in her arms and she could look into his eyes and let them gain strength and assurance from hers. "Papa, guess who is here?" He looked at her. She saw the idea of the truth glimmer into their filmy sadness and be dismissed thence as a wild imagination. He threw himself forward and hid his face once more in his stretched-out arms resting upon the table as heretofore. She heard him whisper. She bent tenderly down to listen. "I don't know. Don't tell me it is Frederick. Not Frederick. I cannot bear it. I am too weak, and his mother is dying." He began to cry and wail like a child. It was so different to all which Margaret had hoped and expected that she turned sick with disappointment and was silent for an instant. Then she spoke again, very differently, not so exultingly, far more tenderly and carefully. "Papa, it is Frederick. Think of Mamma, how glad she will be, and oh, for her sake, how glad we ought to be. For his sake, too, our poor, poor boy." Her father did not change his attitude, but he seemed to be trying to understand the fact. "Where is he?" asked he at last, his face still hidden in his prostrate arms. "In your study, quite alone. I lighted the taper and ran up to tell you. He is quite alone and will be wondering why—" "I will go to him," broke in her father, and he lifted himself up and leaned on her arm as on that of a guide. Margaret led him to the study door, but her spirits were so agitated that she felt she could not bear to see the meeting. She turned away and ran upstairs and cried most heartily. It was the first time she had dared to allow herself this relief for days. The strain had been terrible, as she now felt. But Frederick was come. He, the one precious brother, was there, safe amongst them again. She could hardly believe it. She stopped her crying and opened her bedroom door. She heard no sound of voices and almost feared she might have dreamt. She went downstairs and listened at the study door. She heard the buzz of voices, and that was enough. She went into the kitchen and stirred up the fire and lighted the house and prepared for the wanderer's refreshment. How fortunate it was that her mother slept. She knew that she did, from the candle-lighter thrust through the keyhole of her bedroom door. The traveller could be refreshed and bright, and the first excitement of the meeting with his father all be over before her mother became aware of anything unusual. When all was ready, Margaret opened the study door and went in like a serving maiden, with a heavy tray held in her extended arms. She was proud of serving Frederick, but he, when he saw her, sprang up in a minute and relieved her of her burden. It was a type, a sign of all the coming relief which his presence would bring. The brother and sister arranged the table together, saying little, but their hands touching and their eyes speaking the natural language of expression, so intelligible to those of the same blood. The fire had gone out, and Margaret applied herself to light it, for the evenings had begun to be chilly, and yet it was desirable to make all noises as distant as possible from Mrs. Hale's room. Dixon says it is a gift to light a fire, not an art to be acquired. Poeta nascitur non fit, murmured Mr. Hale, and Margaret was glad to hear a quotation once more, however languidly given. "Dear old Dixon, how we shall kiss each other," said Frederick. "She used to kiss me, and then look in my face to be sure I was the right person, and then set to again. But, Margaret, what a bungler you are! I never saw such a little awkward, good-for-nothing pair of hands. Run away and wash them, ready to cut bread and butter for me, and leave the fire. I'll manage it. Lighting fires is one of my natural accomplishments." So Margaret went away and returned and passed in and out of the room in a glad restlessness that could not be satisfied with sitting still. The more wants Frederick had, the better she was pleased, and he understood all this by instinct. It was a joy snatched in the house of mourning, and the zest of it was all the more pungent, because they knew in the depths of their hearts what irremediable sorrow awaited them. In the middle, they heard Dixon's foot on the stairs. Mr. Hale started from his languid posture in his great armchair, from which he had been watching his children in a dreamy way, as if they were acting some drama of happiness, which it was pretty to look at, but which was distinct from reality, and in which he had no part. He stood up and faced the door, showing such a strange sudden anxiety to conceal Frederick from the sight of any person entering, even though it were the faithful Dixon, that a shiver came over Margaret's heart. It reminded her of the new fear in their lives. She caught at Frederick's arm and clutched it tight, while a stern thought compressed her brows and caused her to set her teeth. And yet they knew it was only Dixon's measured tread. They heard her walk the length of the passage into the kitchen. Margaret rose up. "I will go to her and tell her, and I shall hear how Mamma is." Mrs. Hale was awake. She rambled at first, but after they had given her some tea she was refreshed, though not disposed to talk. It was better that the night should pass over before she was told of her son's arrival. Dr. Donaldson's appointed visit would bring nervous excitement enough for the evening, and he might tell them how to prepare her for seeing Frederick. He was there in the house, could be summoned at any moment. Margaret could not sit still. It was a relief to her to aid Dixon in all her preparations for Master Frederick. It seemed as though she never could be tired again. Each glimpse into the room where he sat by his father, conversing with him about she knew not what nor cared to know, was increase of strength to her. Her own time for talking and hearing would come at last, and she was too certain of this to feel in a hurry to grasp it now. She took in his appearance and liked it. He had delicate features, redeemed from effeminacy by the swarthiness of his complexion and his quick intensity of expression. His eyes were generally merry-looking, but at times they and his mouth so suddenly changed and gave her such an idea of latent passion that it almost made her afraid. But this look was only for an instant, and had in it no doggedness, no vindictiveness. It was rather the instantaneous ferocity of expression that comes over the countenances of all natives of wild or southern countries, a ferocity which enhances the charm of the childlike softness into which such a look may melt away. Margaret might fear the violence of the impulsive nature thus occasionally betrayed, but there was nothing in it to make her distrust or recoil in the least from the new-found brother. On the contrary, all their intercourse was peculiarly charming to her from the very first. She knew then how much responsibility she had had to bear from the exquisite sensation of relief which she felt in Frederick's presence. He understood his father and mother, their characters and their weaknesses, and went along with a careless freedom which was yet most delicately careful not to hurt or wound any of their feelings. He seemed to know instinctively when a little of the natural brilliancy of his manner and conversation would not jar on the deep depression of his father, or might relieve his mother's pain. Whenever it would have been out of tune and out of time, his patient devotion and watchfulness came into play and made him an admirable nurse. Then Margaret was almost touched into tears by the allusions which he often made to their childish days in the New Forest. He had never forgotten her, or Helston either, all the time he had been roaming among distant countries and foreign people. She might talk to him of the old spot and never fear tiring him. She had been afraid of him before he came, even while she had longed for his coming. 7 or 8 years had, she felt, produced such great changes in herself that, forgetting how much of the original Margaret was left, she had reasoned that if her tastes and feelings had so materially altered, even in her stay-at-home life, his wild career, with which she was but imperfectly acquainted, must have almost substituted another Frederick for the tall stripling in his middy's uniform, whom she remembered looking up to with such admiring awe. But in their absence they had grown nearer to each other in age, as well as in many other things. And so it was that the weight, this sorrowful time, was lightened to Margaret. Other light than that of Frederick's presence she had none. For a few hours the mother rallied on seeing her son. She sat with his hand in hers. She would not part with it even while she slept, and Margaret had to feed him like a baby, rather than that he should disturb her mother by removing a finger. Mrs. Hale wakened while they were thus engaged. She slowly moved her head round on the pillow and smiled at her children as she understood what they were doing and why it was done. "I am very selfish," said she, "but it will not be for long." Frederick bent down and kissed the feeble hand that imprisoned his. This state of tranquillity could not endure for many days, nor perhaps for many hours. So Dr. Donaldson assured Margaret. After the kind doctor had gone away, she stole down to Frederick, who, during the visit, had been adjured to remain quietly concealed in the back parlor, usually Dixon's bedroom, but now given up to him. Margaret told him what Dr. Donaldson said. "I don't believe it," he exclaimed. "She is very ill. She may be dangerously ill, and in immediate danger, too, but I can't imagine that she could be as she is if she were on the point of death. Margaret, she should have some other advice, some London doctor. Have you never thought of that?" "Yes," said Margaret, "more than once. But I don't believe it would do any good, and, you know, we have not the money to bring any great London surgeon down, and I am sure Dr. Donaldson is only second in skill to the very best, if indeed he is to them." Frederick began to walk up and down the room impatiently. "I have credit in Cadiz," said he, "but none here, owing to this wretched change of name. Why did my father leave Helston? That was the blunder." "It was no blunder," said Margaret gloomily. "And above all possible chances, avoid letting Papa hear anything like what you have just been saying. I can see that he is tormenting himself already with the idea that Mamma would never have been ill if we had stayed in Helston, and you don't know Papa's agonizing power of self-reproach." Frederick walked away as if he were on the quarter-deck. At last he stopped right opposite to Margaret and looked down at her drooping and desponding attitude for an instant. "My little Margaret," said he, caressing her, "let us hope as long as we can. Poor little woman, what, is this face all wet with tears? I will hope, I will, in spite of 1,000 doctors. Bear up, Margaret, and be brave enough to hope." Margaret choked in trying to speak, and when she did,
It was very low. I must try to be meek enough to trust. Oh, Frederick, Mamma was getting to love me so, and I was getting to understand her. And now comes death to snap us asunder. Come, come, come. Let us go upstairs and do something rather than waste time that may be so precious. Thinking has many a time made me sad, darling, but doing never did in all my life. My theory is a sort of parody on the maxim of, get money, my son, honestly if you can, but get money. My precept is, do something, my sister. Do good if you can, but at any rate, do something. Not excluding mischief, said Margaret, smiling faintly through her tears. By no means. What I do exclude is the remorse afterwards. Blot your misdeeds out, if you are particularly conscientious, by a good deed as soon as you can, just as we did a correct sum at school on the slate, where an incorrect one was only half rubbed out. It was better than wetting our sponge with our tears, both less loss of time where tears had to be waited for, and a better effect at last. If Margaret thought Frederick's theory rather a rough one at first, she saw how he worked it out into continual production of kindness in fact. After a bad night with his mother, for he insisted on taking his turn as a sitter-up, he was busy next morning before breakfast, contriving a leg rest for Dixon, who was beginning to feel the fatigues of watching. At breakfast time, he interested Mr. Hale with vivid, graphic, rattling accounts of the wild life he had led in Mexico, South America, and elsewhere. Margaret would have given up the effort in despair to rouse Mr. Hale out of his dejection. It would even have affected herself and rendered her incapable of talking at all. But Fred, true to his theory, did something perpetually, and talking was the only thing to be done besides eating at breakfast. Before the night of that day, Dr. Donaldson's opinion was proved to be too well-founded. Convulsions came on, and when they ceased, Mrs. Hale was unconscious. Her husband might lie by her, shaking the bed with his sobs. Her son's strong arms might lift her tenderly up into a comfortable position. Her daughter's hands might bathe her face, but she knew them not. She would never recognize them again till they met in heaven. Before the morning came, all was over. Then Margaret rose from her trembling and despondency, and became as a strong angel of comfort to her father and brother. For Frederick had broken down now, and all his theories were of no use to him. He cried so violently when shut up alone in his little room at night that Margaret and Dixon came down in a fright to warn him to be quiet, for the house partitions were but thin, and the next-door neighbors might easily hear his youthful, passionate sobs, so different from the slower, trembling agony of afterlife, when we become inured to grief and dare not be rebellious against the inexorable doom, knowing who it is that decrees. Margaret sat with her father in the room with the dead. If he had cried, she would have been thankful, but he sat by the bed quite quietly, only from time to time he uncovered the face and stroked it gently, making a kind of soft, inarticulate noise, like that of some mother animal caressing her young. He took no notice of Margaret's presence. Once or twice she came up to kiss him, and he submitted to it, giving her a little push away when she had done, as if her affection disturbed him from his absorption in the dead. He started when he heard Frederick's cries and shook his head. Poor boy, he said, and took no more notice. Margaret's heart ached within her. She could not think of her own loss in thinking of her father's case. The night was wearing away, and the day was at hand, when, without a word of preparation, Margaret's voice broke upon the stillness of the room with a clearness of sound that startled even herself. "Let not your heart be troubled," it said,
and she went steadily on through all that chapter of unspeakable consolation.
So the chapter is home at last, which I think is both Frederick, but it is also Mrs. Hale going home to heaven. And, Frederick, right? The golden boy. So the golden boy shows up and, oh, your hands are so small. They're not any good for anything. Here, let me do that for you. And it's so hard to read these chapters because there's the part of me, I don't know about you, there's the part of me that would be so relieved to have some other person in the house during all of that other than Dixon, somebody other than her mother and her father. And having, just a supportive shoulder to go and collapse on every once in a while. But I don't know if Frederick's really giving Margaret that quite so much. I mean, she still seems to be kind of waiting on him. She's talking about how pleasant it is to wait on him. And again, I don't know, is Gaskell doing that because she was afraid that it wouldn't be palatable to a Victorian world if Margaret didn't kind of submit on some level? Or was this just really how people felt back then? I don't know. I really don't know. But Frederick really irked me a lot. And the parents' treatment of, at the end, Margaret going up and giving her dad a kiss, and he kind of pushes her away, and then he hears Frederick crying and says, oh, my poor boy, my poor boy. And then at the end of everything, Margaret is the one, not the pastor and not the boy wonder. Margaret is the one who reads the Bible clearly in the morning. It's a verse from the book of John. Actually, it goes on and says that she reads the entire chapter, but it's John chapter 14, verse 1. At least that's what she starts with. And Margaret, go Margaret. My God, I wouldn't be not even close to her ability to maintain during trials with a capital T. Now, the one thing I will say for Frederick that I think he probably got right is you're feeling lousy, do something. Somebody's dying and you can't help it, stop it, make it go away, do something. I've known people who have a family member who's dying of cancer and there's nothing that can be done, and they paint the bathroom because doing something is better than not doing anything. At least you can say, well, I can't cure cancer, but I can paint the bathroom and it really needed to be painted. And so that is what I'm going to do. And you do it. And that's fine. And I loved Mrs. Thornton's promise to Mrs. Hale. She can't promise to be a friend. She can't promise to care for her, but she can promise to tell Margaret when she's doing something wrong. And that much she can do. And I loved it. But oh, wow. So Mrs. Thornton, tough cookie? Yeah. Because, not just because, but one part of the becauses, she lost a baby. And she's clearly one of those people that it just hurts too much. So we are not going to go there. And we'll just shut that down and compartmentalize that and walk away. And now she has that memory brought back to her. I thought that was very nicely done. And we waited a long time for that, which was also fine. So that's good. And on that note, I leave you. Have a great week. I will talk to you from Pennsylvania next time. Take care. Bye. 351, Chapter 31.
Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 351, Molded, Sprayed, and Lighted. Well, hello. I'm back. For those of you listening in real time, thank you so much for your forbearance during the crazy move. I will have more of that, including what I hope is some useful information for you shortly. But first, I wanted to say thank you to all of you who bid on the books that were coming from Nanette the Nanny. We sold quite a few of them, and the rest are going to be going up on eBay as soon as possible. So that is that. Thank you, all of you who bid. And congratulations to the winners, because they are pretty awesome books. What did you think about the tagline? The new one for living here in Pennsylvania. I can't tell you, I have been laboring over figuring out how to introduce the location that I'm podcasting from, spending far too much of my spare time wandering around going, what could I say? And then I started researching this area, New Hope, Carversville, Soulbury, this whole area. Wow, is there a lot of history here, like the George Washington slept here history, but also the Revolutionary War shells are unexploded shells are still lodged in the ceiling beams, the big wooden joists in homes down by the river because the British were coming. And Washington actually destroyed the ferry that went from New Hope to Lambertville in New Jersey on his, or right before he was about to cross the Delaware, just 6 miles south of us at a place called Washington Crossing, which I love. And they reenact it every Christmas Eve. They do a reenactment of crossing the Delaware in a boat. Very cold, very, very cold. But Washington put the ferry out of commission. And so when the British on the New Jersey side tried to get over here to the Pennsylvania side and rang the bell for the ferry, and no ferry showed up, they assumed that the entire town of New Hope, which wasn't called New Hope at the time, that the entire town was part of the rebels, the colonists. And so they started shelling the city. And that's where the unexploded ordnances came from. And they're still there. Lots of really funky, interesting, odd history around here. Lots of interesting people, too. Oscar Hammerstein being probably the one that you'd know quickest. So all that being said, the Delaware Canal was one of those canals that were used to transport goods. You've heard maybe of the Erie Canal. There's a famous song about the Erie Canal. And that's all great. Delaware Canal was one of the barge canals where you had a mule on a towpath on the side, and the mule would tow your barge upstream. And I think they also towed you downstream if there wasn't much of a current, and there shouldn't have been. And then there's a series of locks and all of that stuff. And there are canals down by D.C., down off the Potomac, canals here, canals all around. And so the Delaware Canal was one of those very important trade routes for a very long time. And the Old York Road used to be the road by which you would go from Philadelphia to New York. Kind of like Broadway being the old Indian footpath from the southern tip of Manhattan Island all the way up to and beyond Albany. This was a similar kind of road. So I went from the New York road that connected the base of Manhattan to upstate, and now I'm living just off the road that connects Philadelphia to New York. So if I keep this up, at some point I'm going to have to move to Canada and hook back up with Broadway and Route 9. And then I guess I'm going to have to go over the top of the world and go into, Russia, probably somewhere. Maybe I could go to Mongolia. I know somebody who's in Mongolia right now. We'll see. We'll see how long it takes me to do that, because I seem to be moving pretty routinely. Although I really don't want to leave here. Here is pretty darn good. And not just because we're out of Sparta and into an actual house, and all of us together in the same place at the same time, which is lovely, but it's green, it's beautiful. Yes, it's humid, which is lousy. Not too bad on the mosquitoes yet, I'm knocking on my head because there probably will be more soon. But so far, so good. And the people are lovely. Very, very nice people. Loving Pennsylvania people. The traffic lights move along at a fine clip. If I were knitting, I would not have time to knit even the side of a TPN on a sock. That's how fast the lights go. And the traffic is not bad, and the back roads are beautiful, and we've already stopped at lots of family-run farms and bought milk in glass bottles, and it's just great. Except for the mold, which is where the title of today's podcast comes from. Molded, sprayed, and lighted. Part of the light is the fact that the traffic lights work. But there's another thing. When we got up here on June 27th, I had to get up at 4 to drive Thing 2 down to his final ear appointment. And then we had to drive from Charlottesville, Virginia, all the way up here, which is a long way. We're fine. I was a little tired when we got to Charlottesville. Good doctor's appointment. All went well. Decided to come up the Shenandoah Valley instead of coming up 95. For any of you who have been on the East Coast, if you know anything about the 95 corridor, it is often a parking lot during rush hour. And I thought the worst possible thing I could do to myself would be to put myself in a situation that was boring, of just sitting in traffic. I would fall asleep. So we went up the Shenandoah Valley. It was lovely, very pretty. The Blue Ridge Mountains, gorgeous. We went over the mountains and then up the valley. And it wasn't quite as, well, where we were, which was the interstate, it's not quite as epic as the song. But it was beautiful. And that meant we cut through the corner of West Virginia, and then we cut through the edge of Maryland, and then we're in Pennsylvania. And we went up around Harrisburg, and then up to Allentown, and then over and down to here. It was 9+ hours of driving on 2 hours of sleep, and I was very, very tired. When we got into the house, and everything seems fine, except when I went up into the attic room, which is where my office is supposed to be. There's this kind of funky smell that wasn't there when we looked at the place in February, because it was freezing. And it wasn't even there in early May, because early May was actually quite chilly here as well. But once the house started to warm up and got a little humid, and it's an old place, so there's no central air, and the owners live next door to us. So it's kind of cool because his grandfather built this house. So there's funky places in it. Like there's I call it the cask of Amontillado room down in the basement. It's a semi-walled in small vestibule off to the side that has a dirt floor, and you could wall someone up in there. It's where you keep the dead bodies and the wine. And now I find out you also keep paint there. So we have our cask of Amontillado room functioning as a wine cellar, and there's an actual well. We have well water. There's a creek out back, and the house has a kind of funky little cutouts in it, and all sorts of little, very Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon. It's very special modification here in New Hope. So the house is great, and it didn't smell before. And now, no central air, warming up, humid. Something's wrong. And the next day, I had to write on this project I was on. And so I decided to, every time I took a break, I was going to work on putting stuff away. So I was writing in the upstairs attic room all day and unpacking things and putting things away and getting my office space in order. The first day I was okay, but had really weird off again, on again headaches. And the second day I was so sick to my stomach and in so much pain that we could not figure out what was going wrong. So I wrote in bed the whole day, and I stayed downstairs, which didn't smell. So by Sunday night, I started thinking to myself, it's the smell. There's something wrong with the smell. So my instinct was, it's mold or mildew. And I don't know if mildew will do this to me, but I'm fairly certain that mold will. So I did the Google, and I found out all about the strange and unpleasant side effects that different kinds of mold can have on humans. And since I'm allergic to mold to begin with, this was probably not going to be a good story. So I started to panic and thought, I'm never going to have an office. I'm going to have to podcast from the basement, which is dark and cold and damp and has spiders. And we started setting up a desk with my computer down in the basement, and it was very, very scary. And I've been recording those scary stories for Chilling Tales for Dark Nights too, and I didn't want to record down there. So scary. Didn't know what to do. Continued to research on various scientific websites and learned a few things about mold that I thought might help you sometime in your life in the future. I hope. Because I wish I had known this before we moved in, or the day that we actually moved the furniture in, because I would have done a much better job. Here's what I learned. Mold hates light, it hates dry, and it hates moving air. And so if you can whack it with all three of those things, moving air, dry air, and light, you won't have mold growing anywhere. Mildew is a different thing, but related. But the mildew evidently doesn't make people sick the way mold spores do. So I was pretty certain that I knew where the mold was. The attic room is a room, and it's about 2/3 of the length of the house, and it has the peaked roof and sloping sides that you would expect to see in an attic. They've sealed off the very top of that peaked roof, so our room has a flat ceiling, but it does have sloping sides, and those sloping sides, they start about 1.5 feet above where the studs are, the wall studs are, to create this central, very large, very roomy, very open room, which is fantastic. And it means that on the sides, the other sides of those wall studs that are creating this rectangular room, you have the sloping eave side, which is great for storage on both sides of the room. It's fantastic. Well, not owning the house and being on a shoestring budget, I got the bright idea to take old bed sheets from a secondhand store. And I measured to make sure that this was going to work, and it did. And I used decorative thumbtacks, and I have tacked up a variety of pleasantly colored sheets all around the room. So I was able to kind of sectionalize the room based on the sheet sets that I used, which turned out to work great. And we put white sheets in between the joists on the ceiling. So it's kind of almost a Tutory looking thing where you've got the joist exposed and white sheets covering the otherwise exposed insulation that was up there because the room was newly insulated. So when I was doing the research on mold and its toxicity and how to get rid of it, I found that old school thinking, which I remember from my childhood, was get some rubber gloves, get some boiling water, get a bunch of bleach, mix together, slop it all over the place, on your hands and knees with a big sponge, and kill that mold. Gosh darn it. And it turns out that kills the top exposed part of the mold. But bleach, shockingly, does nothing to kill the roots of the mold. And mold grows into organic material, which means it has tendrils or roots that are growing down in this case, into the wood, which is horrifying. So I thought two things. I thought, number one, I have a sneaking suspicion that I know where the mold is living. 2, I need to get lights. 3, I need to get fans, one for each side of those eaves rooms. And I'm going to have to clean this, and I'm going to have to find something to clean it with other than bleach, because number one, it's not going to do any good. And number 2, this place, the ventilation is all on one side. There's only one set of windows on one wall. Nothing has been dormered or anything like that. So the airflow was not going to be what I would consider safe to, really release bleach fumes into trapped airspace when there are children around and me. So I got the fans, I got big lights, hooked them up. I turned on the lights and I saw on both sides where water damage had happened. And it looks like it happened a long time ago. But again, dark, moist, humid, it's coming back. So I also found 3 products that I am linking to from the show notes because you are going to want to use these at some point in your life. The first is an anti-smell thing, which I swear to you, I thought it was voodoo. I could not believe that this was real. Zeolite. Zeolite is a volcanic rock. It's a very craggy kind of volcanic rock which means that it has lots of surface area, more surface area than you would think based on the size of the rocks themselves. They're maybe 3/4 of an inch across at any various given point. American pebble-sized, not British pebble-sized. It's like the metric system. It's an American pebble system. So this zeolite stuff, volcanic rock, comes in little plastic netted bags, and you put these into a room that has a malodorous problem, and the rocks adsorb the smell. They don't absorb with a B. They don't absorb smell because that would require liquid. They adsorb smell by bonding the molecules of smelliness in the air with the stone. And this is where I started thinking, okay, this is just malarkey. There's no way that this is real. And then I read, no, it's really real, and the stuff never stops working, because after 4 months, 6 months, wherever it's been, when you think it's not working so well anymore, you take it outside and you set it in the sun. And the chemical reaction between the sunshine and the zeolite releases all of the little molecules and ions that have bonded to it. And then you take it back into the smelly place and it starts adsorbing it again. So really now I'm thinking, yeah, right. I found a scientist's website where the scientists were discussing this. And one of the guys actually worked in a factory where they had to use this. And he said, oh yeah, this stuff is so non-toxic. The guys treat it the same way you'd treat table salt. And it's true. It's absolutely non-toxic. I mean, you don't want to suck on a rock, right? But it's not a problem around animals, around people, around anything. Great. So we got a bunch of those bags to take care of the smell. You can get them on Amazon. I will link to them on Amazon. I also found them at Home Depot. And it's like $6 a bag, and it never stops working. So big score. Then I found this stuff called concrobium, which is a new thing that you can get it as a wash, as a fogger, or as a spray. And it puts a layer of concrobiumness over the top of the mold and seals it in and suffocates it and kills it the way bleach can't. So yay. And I found concrobium. I had to go to a little funky hardware store down in Newtown to get that. But a different product that is very similar called Zep. Zep we found at Home Depot. And that was actually the one we used first. And then we did a follow-up treatment with the concrobium. And it's working. There is no smell. I am now in the attic room, occasionally icing my little recording booth with the window unit air conditioner because it's warm. But otherwise, everything is done. And the fans are 24/7 running in the eaves rooms where the storage space is, and almost done putting the white sheets up on the ceiling, and it's becoming a home. So, north and south. I know, right? What are we here for? North and south. This chapter, if the Hales, Mr. and Frederick, have been annoying you before, they will continue to annoy you in this chapter. But the chapter for next episode, I think you will like better. There are just a couple of things to apprise you of before we get to listening to the chapter itself. One is a curiosity. There was a French woman that Elizabeth Gaskell was thinking about writing a biography on. And there's this one weird throwaway line in today's chapters talking about the charm which the French woman attributed to forbidden pleasures. We can imagine what she was talking about. But nobody has been able to figure out exactly what Gaskell was talking about. And one school of thought is that it was something ascribed to this woman, Madame de Sévigné, which I probably butchered. But there was a book she wrote called Letters. She lived from 1626 to 1696. And then Margaret goes on after that statement by Frederick, forbidden pleasures being the sweetest. She says, well, yes, when you were a child, someone told you that stolen fruit was the sweetest, and so you went out robbing people of their fruit. And she says, you took that statement that stolen fruit is the sweetest. You took that au pied de la lettre. Literally, it means at the foot of the letter, but metaphorically, it means if you take it literally, which I kind of like, because great circular logic. You don't get that very often. But she said, you took that statement literally and then went out and stole fruit instead of understanding the larger metaphorical purpose of the statement. So that the first couple times I listened to it, I got the French, but I wasn't sure if I had the idiomatic meaning correct. And I think you probably could have figured it out on your own, but just in case, always good to know for sure. And aside from those two, I think the rest of what we're going to have to talk about is going to come after the chapter. It's not a particularly long chapter, but it is an important turning point. And I'll catch you with it on the flip side. We'll talk about it then. All right, enjoy chapter 31, or volume 2, chapter 6, depending on which version you have, entitled, Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot?
Chapter 31. Should Old Acquaintance Be Forgot? Show not that manner and these features all, the serpent's cunning, and the sinner's fall? Crab. The chill, shivery October morning came. Not the October morning of the country, with soft silvery mists clearing off before the sunbeams that bring out all the gorgeous beauty of coloring, but the October morning of Milton, whose silver mists were heavy fogs, and where the sun could only show long dusky streets when he did break through and shine. Margaret went languidly about, assisting Dixon in her task of arranging the house. Her eyes were continually blinded by tears, but she had no time to give way to regular crying. The father and brother depended upon her. While they were giving way to grief, she must be working, planning, considering. Even the necessary arrangements for the funeral seemed to devolve upon her. When the fire was bright and crackling, when everything was ready for breakfast, and the tea kettle was singing away, Margaret gave a last look around the room before going to summon Mr. Hale and Frederick. She wanted everything to look as cheerful as possible, and yet, when it did so, the contrast between it and her own thoughts forced her into sudden weeping. She was kneeling by the sofa, hiding her face in the cushions that no one might hear her cry, when she was touched on the shoulder by Dixon.
"Come, Miss Hale, come, my dear. You must not give way, or where shall we all be? There's not another person in the house fit to give a direction of any kind, and there's so much to be done. There's who's to manage the funeral, and who's to come to it, and where it's to be, and all to be settled, and Master Frederick's like one crazed with crying, and Master never was a good one for settling, and poor gentleman, he goes about now as if he was lost. It's bad enough, my dear, I know, but death comes to us all, and you're well off never to have lost any friend till now."
Perhaps so, but this seemed a loss by itself, not to bear comparison with any other event in the world. Margaret did not take any comfort from what Dixon said, but the unusual tenderness of the prim old servant's manner touched her to the heart, and more from a desire to show her gratitude for this than for any other reason, she roused herself up and smiled in answer to Dixon's anxious look at her, and went to tell her father and brother that breakfast was ready. Mr. Hale came as if in a dream, or rather with the unconscious motion of a sleepwalker, whose eyes and mind perceive other things than what are present. Frederick came briskly in, with a forced cheerfulness, grasped her hand, looked into her eyes, and burst into tears. She had to try and think of little nothings to say all breakfast time, in order to prevent the recurrence of her companion's thoughts too strongly to the last meal they had taken together, when there had been a continual strained listening for some sound or signal from the sick room. After breakfast, she resolved to speak to her father about the funeral. He shook his head and assented to all she proposed, though many of her propositions absolutely contradicted one another. Margaret gained no real decision from him, and was leaving the room languidly to have a consultation with Dixon, when Mr. Hale motioned her back to his side. "Ask Mr. Bell," said he in a hollow voice.
Mr. Bell, said she, a little surprised. Mr. Bell of Oxford?
"Mr. Bell," he repeated. "Yes. He was my groomsman." Margaret understood the association.
"I will write today," said she.
He sank again into listlessness. All morning she toiled on, longing for rest, but in a continual whirl of melancholy business. Towards evening, Dixon said to her,
"I've done it, miss. I was really afraid for master that he'd have a stroke with his grief. He's been all this day with poor missus, and when I've listened at the door, I've heard him talking to her, and talking to her as if she was alive. When I went in, he would be quite quiet, but all in a maze like. So I thought to myself, he ought to be roused, and if it gives him a shock at first, it will maybe be the better afterwards. So I've been and told him that I don't think it's safe for Master Frederick to be here, and I don't. It was only on Tuesday when I was out that I met a Southampton man, the first I've seen since I came to Milton. They don't make their way much up here, I think."
"Well, it was young Leonard's, old Leonard's, the draper's son, as great a scamp as ever lived, who plagued his father almost to death, and then ran off to sea. I never could abide him. He was in the Orion at the same time as Master Frederick. I know, though I don't recollect if he was there at the mutiny."
"Did he know you?" said Margaret eagerly. "Why, that's the worst of it. I don't believe he would have known me but for my being such a fool as to call out his name."
"He were a Southampton man in a strange place, or else I should never have been so ready to call cousins with him, a nasty good-for-nothing fellow. Says he, 'Miss Dixon, who would have thought of seeing you here?' But perhaps I mistake, and you're Miss Dixon no longer. So I told him he might still address me as an unmarried lady, though if I hadn't been so particular, I'd have had a good chance of matrimony. He was polite enough. He couldn't look at me and doubt me. But I were not to be caught with such chaff from such a fellow as him, and so I told him, and by way of being even, I asked him after his father, who I knew had turned him out of doors, as if they were the best friends as ever was. So then, to spite me, for you see we were getting savage for all we were so civil to each other, he began to inquire after Master Frederick, and said what a scrape he'd got into, as if Master Frederick's scrapes would ever wash George Leonard's white, or make him look otherwise than nasty dirty black, and how he'd be hung for mutiny if ever he were caught, and how £100 reward had been offered for catching him, and what a disgrace he had been to his family. All to spite me, you see, my dear, because before now I've helped old Mr. Leonard's to give George a good rating down in Southampton. So I said there were other families be thankful if they could think they were earning an honest living, as I knew, who had far more cause to blush for their sons, and so far away from home. To which he made answer, like the impudent chap he is, that he were in a confidential situation, and if I knew of any young man who had been so unfortunate as to lead vicious courses and wanted to turn steady, he'd have no objection to lend him his patronage. He indeed! Why, he'd corrupt a saint. I've not felt so bad myself for years as when I was standing talking to him the other day. I could have cried to think I couldn't spite him better, for
He kept smiling in my face as if he took all my compliments for earnest, and I couldn't see that he minded what I said in the least, while I was mad with all his speeches.
But you did not tell him anything about us, about Frederick?
Not I, said Dixon. He had never the grace to ask where I was staying, and I shouldn't have told him if he had asked, nor did I ask him what his precious situation was. He was waiting for a bus, and just then it drove up and he hailed it. But, to plague me to the last, he turned back before he got in and said, "If you can help me to trap Lieutenant Hale, Miss Dixon, we'll go partners in the reward. I know you'd like to be my partner now, wouldn't you? Don't be shy, but say yes." And he jumped on the bus, and I saw his ugly face leering at me with a wicked smile to think how he'd had the last word of plaguing.
Margaret was made very uncomfortable by this account of Dixon's. "Have you told Frederick?" asked she.
"No," said Dixon. "I were uneasy in my mind at knowing that bad Leonards was in town, but there was so much else to think about that I did not dwell on it at all. But when I saw Master sitting so stiff and with his eyes so glazed and sad, I thought it might rouse him to have to think of Master Frederick's safety a bit. So I told him all, though I blushed to say how a young man had been speaking to me. And it has done Master good, and if we're to keep Master Frederick in hiding, he would have to go, poor fellow, before Mr. Bell came."
"Oh, I'm not afraid of Mr. Bell, but I am afraid of this Leonards. I must tell Frederick. What did Leonards look like?"
"A bad-looking fellow, I can assure you, miss. Whiskers such as I should be ashamed to wear, they're so red. And for all he said he'd got a confidential situation, he was dressed in fustian, just like a working man."
It was evident that Frederick must go. Go, too, when he had so completely vaulted into his place in the family and promised to be such a stay and staff to his father and sister. Go when his cares for the living mother and sorrow for the dead seemed to make him one of those peculiar people who are bound to us by a fellow love for them that are taken away. Just as Margaret was thinking all this, sitting over the drawing-room fire, her father restless and uneasy under the pressure of this newly aroused fear of which he had not as yet spoken, Frederick came in. His brightness dimmed, but the extreme violence of his grief passed away. He came up to Margaret and kissed her forehead. "How wan you look, Margaret," said he in a low voice. "You have been thinking of everybody, and no one has thought of you. Lie on this sofa. There is nothing for you to do." "That is the worst," said Margaret in a sad whisper. But she went and lay down, and her brother covered her feet with a shawl, and then sat on the ground by her side, and the two began to talk in a subdued tone. Margaret told him all that Dixon had related of her interview with young Leonards. Frederick's lips closed with a long sigh of dismay.
"I should just like to have it out with that young fellow. A worse sailor was never on board ship, nor a much worse man either. I declare, Margaret, you know the circumstances of the whole affair?"
"Yes, Mamma told me."
"Well, when all the sailors who were good for anything were indignant with our captain, this fellow, to curry favour, pah! And to think of his being here. Oh, if he'd a notion I was within 20 miles of him, he'd ferret me out to pay off old grudges. I'd rather anybody had the £100 they think I am worth than that rascal. What a pity poor old Dixon could not be persuaded to give me up and make a provision for her old age."
"Oh, Frederick, hush! Don't talk so." Mr. Hale came towards them, eager and trembling. He had overheard what they were saying. He took Frederick's hand in both of his.
"My boy, you must go. It is very bad, but I see you must. You have done all you could. You have been a comfort to her."
"Oh, Papa, must he go?" said Margaret, pleading against her own conviction of necessity.
I declare I've a good mind to face it out and stand my trial. If I could only pick up my evidence. I cannot endure the thought of being in the power of such a blackguard as Leonard's. I could almost have enjoyed, in other circumstances, this stolen visit. It has had all the charm which the French women attributed to forbidden pleasures.
One of the earliest things I can remember, said Margaret, was your being in some great disgrace, Fred, for stealing apples. We had plenty of our own, trees loaded with them, but someone had told you that stolen fruit tasted sweetest, which you took au pied de la lettre, and off you went a robbing. You have not changed your feelings much since then.
Yes, you must go, repeated Mr. Hale, answering Margaret's question, which she had asked some time ago. His thoughts were fixed on one subject, and it was an effort to him to follow the zigzag remarks of his children, an effort which he did not make. Margaret and Frederick looked at each other. That quick momentary sympathy would be theirs no longer if he went away. So much was understood through eyes that could not be put into words. Both coursed the same thought till it was lost in sadness. Frederick shook it off first. Do you know, Margaret, I was very nearly giving both Dixon and myself a good fright this afternoon. I was in my bedroom. I had heard a ring at the front door, but I thought the ringer must have done his business and gone away long ago, so I was on the point of making my appearance in the passage when, as I opened my room door, I saw Dixon coming downstairs, and she frowned and kicked me into hiding again. I kept the door open and heard a message given to some man that was in my father's study, and that then went away. Who could it have been? Some of the shopmen?
Very likely, said Margaret indifferently. There was a little quiet man who came up for orders about 2 o'clock.
But this was not a little man, a great powerful fellow, and it was past 4 when he was here.
It was Mr. Thornton, said Mr. Hale. They were glad to have drawn him into the conversation. Mr. Thornton, said Margaret, a little surprised. I thought—
Well, little one, what did you think? Asked Frederick as she did not finish her sentence.
Oh, only, said she, reddening and looking straight at him. I fancied you meant someone of a different class, not a gentleman, somebody come on an errand.
He looked like someone of that kind, said Frederick carelessly. I took him for a shopman, and he turns out a manufacturer.
Margaret was silent. She remembered how at first, before she knew his character, she had spoken and thought of him just as Frederick was doing. It was but a natural impression that was made upon him, and yet she was a little annoyed by it. She was unwilling to speak. She wanted to make Frederick understand what kind of person Mr. Thornton was, but she was tongue-tied. Mr. Hale went on. He came to offer any assistance in his power, I believe, but I could not see him. I told Dixon to ask him if he would like to see you. I think I asked her to find you and you would go to him. I don't know what I said. He has been a very agreeable acquaintance, has he not? Asked Frederick, throwing the question like a ball for anyone to catch who chose. A very kind friend, said Margaret when her father did not answer. Frederick was silent for a time. At last he spoke. Margaret, it is painful to think I can never thank those who have shown you kindness. Your acquaintances and mine must be separate. Unless, indeed, I run the chance of a court-martial, or unless you and my father would come to Spain. He threw out this last suggestion as a kind of feeler, and then suddenly made the plunge. You don't know how I wish you would. I have a good position, the chance of a better, continued he, reddening like a girl. That Dolores Barber that I was telling you of, Margaret, I only wish you knew her. I'm sure you would like her. No, love is the right word. Like is so poor. You would love her, father, if you knew her. She is not 18, but if she is in the same mind another year, she is to be my wife. Mr. Barber won't let us call it an engagement. But if you would come, you would find friends everywhere besides Dolores. Think of it, father. Margaret, be on my side." "No, no more removals for me," said Mr. Hale. "One removal has cost me my wife. No more removals in this life. She will be here, and here will I stay out my appointed time."
"Oh, Frederick," said Margaret, "tell us more about her. I never thought of this, but I am so glad. You will have someone to love and care for you out there. Tell us all about it."
"In the first place, she is a Roman Catholic. That's the only objection I anticipated. But my father's change of opinion— Nay, Margaret, don't sigh." Margaret had reason to sigh a little more before the conversation ended. Frederick himself was Roman Catholic, in fact, though not in profession as yet. This was, then, the reason why his sympathy in her extreme distress at her father's leaving the church had been so faintly expressed in his letters. She had thought it was the carelessness of a sailor, but the truth was that even then he was himself inclined to give up the form of religion into which he had been baptized, only that his opinions were tending in exactly the opposite direction to those of his father. How much love had to do with this change, not even Frederick himself could have told. Margaret gave up talking about this branch of the subject at last, and, returning to the fact of the engagement, she began to consider it in some fresh light.
"But for her sake, Fred, you surely will try and clear yourself of the exaggerated charges brought against you, even if the charge of mutiny itself be true. If there were to be a court-martial, and you could find your witnesses, you might, at any rate, show how your disobedience to authority was because that authority was unworthily exercised."
Mr. Hale roused himself up to listen to his son's answer. "In the first place, Margaret, who is to hunt up my witnesses? All of them are sailors, drafted off to other ships, except those whose evidence would go for very little, as they took part or sympathized in the affair. In the next place, allow me to tell you, you don't know what a court-martial is, and consider it as an assembly where justice is administered, instead of what it really is, a court where authority weighs 9/10 in the balance, and evidence forms only the other 10th. In such cases, evidence itself can hardly escape being influenced by the prestige of authority."
"But is it not worth trying to see how much evidence might be discovered and arrayed on your behalf? At present, all those who knew you formerly believe you guilty without any shadow of excuse. You have never tried to justify yourself, and we have never known where to seek for proofs of your justification. Now, for Miss Barber's sake, make your conduct as clear as you can in the eye of the world. She may not care for it. She has, I am sure, that trust in you that we all have. But you ought not to let her ally herself to one under such a serious charge, without showing the world exactly how it is you stand. You disobeyed authority. That was bad, but to have stood by without word or act while the authority was brutally used would have been infinitely worse. People know what you did, but not the motives that elevate it out of a crime into a heroic protection of the weak. For Dolores's sake, they ought to know."
"But how must I make them know? I am not sufficiently sure of the purity and justice of those who would be my judges to give myself up to a court-martial, even if I could bring a whole array of truth-speaking witnesses. I can't send a bellman about to cry aloud and proclaim in the streets what you are pleased to call my heroism. No one would read a pamphlet of self-justification so long after the deed, even if I put one out."
"Will you consult a lawyer as to your chances of exculpation?"
asked Margaret, looking up and turning very red.
I must first catch my lawyer and have a look at him and see how I like him before I make him into my confidant. Many a briefless barrister might twist his conscience into thinking that he could earn £100 very easily by doing a good action, in giving me, a criminal, up to justice.
Nonsense, Frederick, because I know a lawyer on whose honour I can rely, of whose cleverness in his profession people speak very highly, and who would, I think, take a good deal of trouble for any of Aunt Shaw's relations. Mr. Henry Lennox, Papa.
I think it is a good idea, said Mr. Hale, but don't propose anything which will detain Frederick in England. Don't, for your mother's sake.
You could go to London tomorrow evening by a night train, continued Margaret, warming up into her plan. He must go tomorrow, I'm afraid, Papa, said she tenderly. We fixed that because of Mr. Bell and Dixon's disagreeable acquaintance.
Yes, I must go tomorrow, said Frederick decidedly. Mr. Hale groaned. I can't bear to part with you, and yet I am miserable with anxiety as long as you stop here.
Well then, said Margaret, listen to my plan. He gets to London on Friday morning. No, it would be better for me to give him a note to Mr. Lennox. You will find him at his chambers in the Temple.
I will write down a list of all the names I can remember on board the Orion. I could leave it with him to ferret them out. He is Edith's husband's brother, isn't he? I remember your naming him in your letters. I have money in Barbara's hands. I can pay a pretty long bill, if there is any chance of success. Money, dear father, that I had meant for a different purpose, so I shall only consider it as borrowed from you and Margaret.
Don't do that, said Margaret. You won't risk it if you do, and it will be a risk, only it is worth trying. You can sail from London as well as from Liverpool?
To be sure, little goose. Wherever I feel water heaving under a plank, there I feel at home. I'll pick up some craft or other to take me off, never fear. I won't stay 24 hours in London away from you on the one hand and from somebody else on the other.
It was rather a comfort to Margaret that Frederick took it into his head to look over her shoulder as she wrote to Mr. Lennox. If she had not been thus compelled to write steadily and concisely on, she might have hesitated over many a word, and been puzzled to choose between many an expression, in the awkwardness of being the first to resume the intercourse of which the concluding event had been so unpleasant to both sides. However, the note was taken from her before she had even had time to look it over, and treasured up in a pocket-book, out of which fell a long lock of black hair, the sight of which caused Frederick's eyes to glow with pleasure.
"Now you would like to see that, wouldn't you?" said he. "No, you must wait till you see her herself. She is too perfect to be known by fragments. No mean brick shall be a specimen of the building of my palace."
So, Frederick's got to get out of Dodge. And he's got a girl. And she's Catholic. I don't know for certain. It's very hard to find hard and fast definitive statements to this effect. But I think for Margaret, who's already sustained so many shocks to her soul at this point, that this is just another one, and it can't be any bigger or worser than any other shock she's had to her system once her father defected from the Church of England. But I was listening to a very interesting radio interview on Sunday morning this last weekend, and it was one of the appropriately Sunday morning shows that discusses matters of faith and belief, and sometimes that means that they're talking to scientists, and sometimes it means that they're talking to religious people, and this time it meant that they were talking to an historian. And this guy, I'll see if I can look this up and find this information again. He was talking about a book he'd written on the history of the separation between church and state as a value that Americans take very seriously. And he said that he was constantly surprised by his research because it wasn't what he thought it was going to be about. And as he started to research, how did we arrive at our modern understanding that we are supposed to be guaranteed a right to not have religion imposed upon us, but that the root of our modern understanding and judicial writings on the topic came from a Supreme Court justice who was a Ku Klux Klan member. And this is when my jaw hit the floor. You may have heard it from where you are. This particular Supreme Court justice, Ku Klux Klan member, exposed the fact to this professor, this author, that people didn't just join the Ku Klux Klan because they were racist, although that was definitely a massive part of the group's ideology. But part of the purpose was to not just keep races pure, but to keep religion pure. And that means anti-Catholic sentiment. And that means that when this justice gets on the Supreme Court and he's writing about the separation of church and state, he's actually trying to prevent Catholicism and the Protestant belief that a Catholic could never be president because the Catholic would have sworn his allegiance to the Pope in Rome first and then to the country, and that there would be this horrible and constant tug of war, this conflict between adherence to a papal leader versus being a governmental, a legislative or executive leader. And the separation of church and state was written to prevent having that happen, which I found fascinating because we don't seem to see that problem anymore. Of course, John F. Kennedy was our first Catholic president, so I guess there was no reason to fear having a Catholic president, eh? But that's certainly not the way that I think of the separation of church and state having been started in this country. It's easy to forget how anti-Catholic the country had been at one point and for a long stretch of it. So when Frederick comes out and says, oh, I have this woman, and if she'll still have me in a year, then we'll get married. And oh, by the way, she's Catholic. And oh, by the way, pretty much so am I. For Margaret not to drop and just give up at that point is kind of stupendous. And part of it, I'm sure, is just that she's numb at this point. But it's also that she's been learning. And we get, a really nice vision of that in this chapter when Frederick is so dismissive of Thornton. I thought he looked like a shopkeeper. And Margaret's like, I didn't understand who you were talking about. I didn't realize you were talking about a gentleman. Ho, ho. How many pages was it when she was all up in his face about, I don't think gentleman means what you think it means kind of thing? Wow. So that's a sea change right there. And it made me think, sometimes you don't realize how you really think of or feel about something until you hear somebody else complaining about it. And now she has an inkling of what she thinks. Maybe, if she lets herself think about it for real, about Mr. Thornton. So, today's chapter, not the most exciting, I know. I promise you, next chapter will make up for it. Until then, have a great week. I will talk to you very soon, and you take care. Bye.
You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at craftlit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit.
from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.